Planning Committee meeting for Monday, October 21st, 2019. Something I was supposed to remember to do today, maybe in a school or a place of worship somewhere. It'll come to me before the end of the meeting. Hopefully we're done soon enough that everybody can go and deal with that. Looking for disclosure of pecuniary interest and general nature thereof, Council. Seeing none. Looking for approval of minutes for September 16th FSP. Moved by Councillor Hanmer, seconded by Councillor Veith. All those in favor? That's carried. That takes us right down to staff reports. 6A, Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program, Community Culture and Recreation Funding Grant Application. Staff are available to answer any questions that Council may have, and I do note proponents from some of our institutions here, which are referenced in this document, are available as well, and if there are questions, I will make sure to direct them their way. Questions, Council? Folks are good? Councillor Hanmer?
Thank you. Through you, Chair Henry. Question probably I'll start with staff, but it may be to one of the proponents that are in audience. I think a good thing that we're doing with this proposal, it looks like lots of partnership opportunities. And so specifically around one of the partnerships with University of Waterloo and the expansion of the facility there, what's the impact going to be on the city by having that second ice pad potentially available?
So through Commissioner Stra, and then maybe I'll look to Rolly.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Hamner. Through Councillor to Councillor Hamner. Thank you for the question. In terms of usage, great opportunity for us to have access to this facility, and helps community both on skill development levels, some of our affiliate group, as well as our adults. So we'll gain time. We're just at the point where we could see in the next 5 to 10 years our usage prime time peaking out. This will enable us in the future to see that time come available to the public with this relationship and partnership. So it's an exciting opportunity from our Commission's perspective.
Great, thank you. Just to follow on that, and I'm presuming that with the other partnership with Wilfrid Laurier, it would be the same thing. It's a stadium.
Yeah, similarly there, the same type of access would be the vision forward for us at a community level. So again, that helps us out as well.
I think we're all right. So that's useful. Any other questions, Council? Seeing none, I'll look for a mover of the report, Councillor Veith, seconded by Councillor Bonnegar. Yes, and certainly this is an excellent opportunity for us. Hopefully, we get at least something funded in the city, knowing that there's going to be a lot of competition for these federal and provincial dollars. But certainly, there's nowhere better to invest that money than right here in Waterloo. All those in favour? Carried. Next up, we have a couple of items on implementation of the Brownfield Financial Incentive Program. First up is the TIG program for 119 Rogers Street. Again, recommendations are before us. Staff are available to respond to any questions. Are there any questions, Council? Councillor Bodley? Yep.
My question was just through you, Chair Henry. My question is just, do we know whether or not the applicant is planning on meeting the current zoning, or if the applicant is looking for some sort of zone change amendment to the site?
So through Chair Henry to Councillor Bonnegar, we might need to defer that one to Ron Ormson with IPPW in terms of the zoning requirements and if that's part of this application. But I believe that the brownfield would require that they meet the zoning. That wouldn't be part of this approval right now.
And sorry, maybe before you answer there, Ron. So that I guess that leads into the second part of my question. Approving the brownfield has nothing to do with what the ultimate application comes forward. Is that fair to say that they're separate processes?
Through you, Chair Henry, to Councillor Bodley. Yes, that's correct. So the zoning, land use zoning, is independent of the brownfield TIG application.
And the last council dealt with revision on this site. And the result of that is, I think, one of the appendices you see here. Other questions? Seeing none, I'll look for a mover. Councillor Bonagor, seconded by Councillor Bodley. And I'll note that I think we all hope that the region has its own process to deal with, but I know the DC part of that would be very helpful from our fiscal perspective if it was dealt with the region grandfathered under its program. All those in favor? That's carried. And next up, we have Brownfield's Financial Incentive Program, TIG program for 70 King Street North. Questions, Council, on this item? Seeing none, I'll look for a mover. Moved by Councillor Bonagor, seconded by Mayor Jaworski. Any comments? All those in favor? You want comments, Mayor? Well, all those in favor? That's carried.
I just think it's good to know that these brownfield financial incentives aren't used very often. I was just speaking with Philippa. It was only one in the past 5 years. So here we are cleaning up 2 sites in beautiful uptown Waterloo, and I think this will be a great way of making sure that we have more residents and more enthusiasm in our uptown area. So I think it's a very good investment of money, which will be generated from the tax increase.
And the community always benefits from having sites that are clean rather than not clean. Okay, so that's already been dealt with. Moving on to 2020 Canada Day, and report prepared by Sarah in Culture. I don't see a presentation on this one either, but certainly staff are available for any questions that Council may have. Questions? Councillor Bonagor.
Through you, Chair Henry. I just have one question about the drone display that would be in place of the fireworks. I'd like to know how the costs each kind of equate to each other. Are they in the same ballpark? And is the drone display, is that a 1-year cost, or is that something that we can essentially redo or reuse, or is there some kind of reusability of any portion of that?
Through you, Chair Henry. So the drone show is approximately twice what conventional fireworks would cost, but with significantly lower environmental impacts. We would be, if we decide to go that route, we would be contracting a company that does this, so brings in drones and programs them according to our specifications. So we're not purchasing the drones, we would be contracting a service.
If I could just follow up, do we know of any local companies that would be doing it just in a more sustainable financial way going forward, or any of the university programs that might want to take this on as a design challenge?
So through you, Chair Henry, at this point, we've just done preliminary research to do some base costing for the event. To our knowledge, there isn't anybody local. At the moment, there isn't anybody in Canada that we've been able to find that does this. We were able to find a company in Michigan, so minimal in terms of transportation expenses. We would certainly be happy to look at other options, and I think that as we move down the road of actually planning the event, that would certainly be something that we would take on, is contacting the universities to see if there was a potential for partnerships.
Right. Partnerships are always beneficial, not just there, but in other forums, in terms of how many community players we can get on board with this, both in kind and financially. I know would help us defray costs of delivering an event that we didn't have to deliver for a large number of years. Any other questions, Council? Councillor Bodley?
Through you, Chair Henry. I just note in the presentation, as a resident, I always found the connection between the University of Waterloo Student Federation outreach to the community tenuous. Like, I never made that connection myself. I always thought this was a city, an event that the university was hosting. So I appreciate from their perspective that maybe they weren't getting what they were looking for, what the original intent of the celebration was. But one of the things that I note in the report is that the University of Waterloo is seeking new opportunities to build connections with the community, which I think is really great. And I want to understand, when I read that, I a little bit think, well, they're looking at something to replace doing what they were doing here. Do we have any idea what those new opportunities are? Are we working with them to try and help build more connections with the community in general, I guess?
Perhaps Mr. Dijkstrak could respond to that?
Acting CAO / town and gown / all the things today.
Yes, through the chair to the councillor. Ongoing work with U of W is a key pillar or part of what we do in community services and a number of the other sections, divisions as well. So whether it's events that they bring in speakers, they want to advance that further. If it's, and I would say it's more their on-campus events and coordination and outreach to the community where they want to provide that support in line with their academic, focus. And also, right now, they're in the midst, I'm aware, of a new strategic plan, and I'm sure as that rolls out, we'll see more touchdowns or more points with the communities. They recognize they're part of this community and want to see how that can evolve. The previous event wasn't quite aligning where they wanted to be, and as a result, we're here today.
Any other questions on this item, Council? Seeing none, I will look for a mover. Councillor Hanmer, Councillor Veith, and I would note for Council's information from a budget chair standpoint that effectively we're acceding to a budget request that's going to come through at budget time. Otherwise, that would be very difficult for a Steros team for us to agree in October and then disagree in February. So just as a note. I'll take the vote now. All those in favor? That's carried. So for Philippa's team, I guess this moves now into the committed column in the various items that we'll have to see at budget time. Next up, we have release of funding for heritage assets from Facility Design and Management. Any questions on this item for Sunda or Michelle? Moved by Mayor Jaworski, seconded by Councillor Vasic. All those in favor? That's carried. We'll get some conservation plans and apparently a foundation. Foundations sound important. Okay, next up, item F, development charge background study and update. And here we have a presentation, which is useful because development charges are a substantial portion of our budget process and planning for growth. Michael, when you're ready, and then we'll hear from our consultants as well.
Thank you. Welcome, Chair Henry, Council, staff, members of the public. We're here today to present alongside with Stefan from Hempson Consulting. We'll be delivering a joint presentation to inform you on our development charges background study and bylaw update. I'm just going to pass it over to Stefan quickly to kind of give Council an overview of development charges and a bit of background on why we're doing this.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of Council. We thought we'd just, rather than get into the meat and potatoes immediately, just give you a broad introduction to development charges, because I heard this morning this is the first time you're dealing with development charge matters this year, and there may be some councillors who are new to development charges. So just, I apologize for those of you for whom you deal with this a lot, but just by way of a brief introduction, when we're talking about development charges, we're talking about fees that are imposed on developers to pay for growth-related capital costs. So capital costs only, not operating costs, and capital costs only to the extent that they're related to the expansion or upgrade of services to meet the increased needs of new development. And the principle behind these charges is that growth should pay for itself, so that the cost of expanding services is not borne by your existing taxpayers or ratepayers. Development charges are imposed by bylaw, and the maximum life of a development charge bylaw is 5 years after the day it was passed. So your current bylaw expires in 2022, and Michael's going to explain to you why we're dealing with it a couple of years before its expiry. Before you pass a new bylaw, you're required to undertake a background study, and that's what we at Hempson were retained to assist you with. That background study is now complete and was released to the public last Thursday. You're also required to undertake a public meeting, and that public meeting has been scheduled for November the 18th. After the bylaw is passed, there's a period of time where anybody can appeal the rates that you impose and any of the provisions of the bylaw as well, and those appeals are adjudicated at the local planning appeal tribunal. The governing legislation that regulates development charges is the Development Charges Act, and there's a prescribed methodology for calculating the charges under that act. So we have to undertake a forecast of future development. We have to have some understanding of the infrastructure needs of that development, and essentially the charge is a simple calculation of the forecasted growth, or the forecasted costs of providing that infrastructure divided by the forecasted growth, and the charge is imposed on residential development as a charge per unit, with a higher charge for larger units like single detached units, and then a lower charge for the apartment kinds of dwellings. And then for non-residential development, it's a charge imposed per square meter of new floor area of non-residential building space. The final thing I'll say about them is that when you look at the bylaw and the charges in the bylaw, you'll see that it's actually a series of charges. So there's a separate charge for each service for which you impose a charge. The legislation distinguishes two types of services. So there are services for which you can impose a charge for 100% of the growth-related capital costs, and those are often referred to as the hard services, and Michael will be referring to those as hard services. And then there are a group of services for which you can only set the charge to recover 90% of growth-related capital cost, the so-called soft services. Okay, so with that in mind, I'll hand it back to Michael. We're going to tag team this as we go through.
Okay, thanks, Stefan, for that overview. That will tie in nicely to some of the terms and things that we'll be talking about throughout the course of the afternoon. So the presentation today is basically going through the staff report that's in front of you, kind of in the same order, but a little bit of a skimmed down version. So I'm going to touch on most of the points that are in the staff report, and we'll entertain questions at the end of the presentation if council has some. So a recap of Bill 108. We've heard of Bill 108 coming into play around May of this year from the province. There's been some reports to council on the implications of Bill 108, not just on development charges, but our budgeting in general. The CBC is to become effective January 1st, 2020, based on draft regulations. We'll get further confirmation hopefully in the next few weeks once Parliament's back in session. And the thinking is that existing DC bylaws can remain in force up to January 1st of 2021. However, new DC bylaws for soft services or general services, as Stefan noted, are not to be permitted once the CBC regime takes effect, and that's tentatively scheduled for January 1st, 2020 based on the draft regulations. So we've had to adjust our timeline for the development charge update because of this information. So the original plan was to bring the full citywide budget along with development charges for council's approval in February of 2020, basically budgeting capital for growth-related and other city initiatives in the same process to balance that effect. What we've had to do now is, because of Bill 108 coming through midway through our update process, we've had to adjust our timeline to get the development charge passed for hard and soft services prior to January 1st, 2020. So the intention was to align the DC update with the citywide budget, but that was no longer feasible and fully achievable through the introduction of Bill 108 midway through our process. Looking a bit at the timelines of what our original plans were versus the revised timeline, there's still, the industry and council will still have 60 days to review the background study and the draft bylaw and all those documents as originally intended. The only difference is that we're releasing the information a bit earlier than planned to council and to the public. So we're holding our update today to council on November 18th, as Stefan mentioned. We're holding our formal public meeting as per the Development Charges Act. On December 16th, 2019, we'll be bringing the bylaw back. That'll be the final bylaw for council's approval, and it will be enacted, and then new rates would be anticipated to take effect on December 31st, 2019. So the only difference is that there's a bit of a time difference between when council can review the full citywide budget along with the growth-related capital program. We have about a week's worth of overlap between December 9th when the citywide budget is released and December 16th when council approved the DC bylaw. Touching on the growth-related capital program a little bit, it's the largest influencing factor of the actual development charge rate calculation. Staff have taken a balanced approach in developing the capital program alongside other capital items from the city. Consideration was taken for growth as well as other non-growth related strategic priorities or enhancements that often compete for that same share of non-development charge funding that the city is bound by. For context, the draft growth-related capital program over the next 10 years in the current background study is $163 million in 2019 dollars compared to $165 million in our 10-year forecast a couple years ago. So very comparable. There's been some changes up and down, but on a holistic approach, it's a very similar program to previously approved. The population and employment forecast data that's comprised in the background study is based on the region's quote modified forecast, which in essence achieves the targets in a manner more aligned with recent growth we've been seeing. It was felt it was a very aggressive growth target, the original one from the province. So the forecast still achieves the provincial growth plan's 2031 targets, but 10 years later by 2041. The region has started using this moderate forecast in various master plans that they've been undertaking, as well as their recent DC study update that they just completed back in the summer. Also to note that the city is actually using the region's modified forecast for our transportation master plan update that we're undertaking as well currently. And staff feel it's the most realistic and prudent forecast to use for the DC bylaw update because it's more realistic with what we've been seeing in practice over the past few years. And just also to note that the population forecast does include permanent residents, but it also includes off-campus students living in the city. It does not, however, include on-campus students living in residence. So because Waterloo has such a large student population, we do layer in that student population living off campus. As is done in previous DC bylaws, staff have solicited input from an external industry working group to work with staff to provide comments and feedback on a DC update study process. Things like the forecast population, the capital project sheets, any policy items, things to that effect. The group's comprised of representatives with various technical and professional backgrounds from the Waterloo Region Home Builders Association, Waterloo's Economic Development Advisory Committee, and the KW Chamber of Commerce. Discussions are still ongoing with the group, and they've been instrumental in moving the background study forward while giving the industry an opportunity to provide feedback and insight along the way. Staff have reviewed the draft DC capital program with this group. The dialogue was very beneficial for our purposes, and only minor changes and suggestions were submitted by the group that have been incorporated into the final drafts of the project sheets where necessary. Updates have also been posted on the city's website for the general public awareness to provide information on the study and the bylaw update in general. And it's also to disseminate relevant information as it becomes available for the public to view. I'm going to now pass it back over to Stefan to talk to council about consideration of area-rated DCs.
Thank you, Michael. So members of committee, you'll see in the recommendations that you're being asked to review and approve today in the staff report that one of them asks you to resolve to continue your current practice of imposing development charges on a city-wide basis. And the reason we have this resolution before you today is that in 2015 the development charges legislation was amended so that councils are now required to consider the use of area-specific development charges. So there's quite a lot of discretion given to councils to how to structure the charge. So for many, many years the city has imposed charges on a city-wide basis. So all development of the city, regardless of where you are, pays the same rate. But you can, if you wish, choose to have different rates apply to different locations in the city, and indeed some municipalities adopt this approach. The approach is really only ever used for very specific services, chiefly water, wastewater, and storm drainage and control services. These are the services where you can draw the benefiting area of the infrastructure on a map. It's very difficult to do that with roads or libraries or parks and recreation, where everyone in the city has access to these services. Whereas with a pipe extending into a greenfield area, you can quite easily draw the benefiting area of the pipe, and that lends itself to an area-specific development charge. However, in the city, from the perspective of the people who actually pay the charge, the water and wastewater and stormwater components of the charge are just under 9% of the overall development charge that developers pay when they come to pay the charge here. And that would include the regional charges as well, which are all done on a region-wide basis. So we're talking about a relatively small component of the overall payment. A few things that we consider and councils consider when looking at area-specific charges is that they most often apply in areas where there is development in so-called green fields, particularly sort of, as I mentioned, the extension of pipes into areas which are not developed yet, or the construction of pumping stations into areas which are not developed yet. And so often the distinction is made between the kinds of servicing that's required to switch on those areas and bring them into the developed area versus the kinds of servicing that's required to be expanded in areas that are already developed. Of course, in Waterloo, you've got very, very small amount of greenfield area, and it's rapidly diminishing as time goes by. So the other issue is, of course, the question of equity, and the argument for area-specific charges is often that you can align the benefits of infrastructure more closely with the amount of the charge that's actually paid by the users of that infrastructure. In Waterloo, however, it has been the long-standing practice of the city to use citywide rates, and the argument that certainly we heard from the development community, among others, is that for those remaining greenfield developers, there is, and there perhaps should be, a reasonable expectation that they pay development charges under the same framework that previous greenfield developers enjoyed in the city. And finally, there are issues of inequity as well whenever we move from a citywide to an area-specific framework, because we have already collected monies in the past under a citywide framework, so that would involve some reallocation of those monies to the area-specific areas. And the final thing to consider is the complexity and additional administrative burden that comes with moving to an area-specific regime. These are now more complicated rate structures, more complicated reserve fund management that goes along with that. So, having considered all of those factors, the citywide approach continues to be the most appropriate in our view. That's consistent with the current practice and the long-standing historical practice. It's consistent with the findings of the background study that was done as early as 2 years ago, and indeed the one I was involved in 2012, where we actually did some calculations of what the differential rates would be, and it was demonstrated that it would be plus or minus $150 on a single detached unit, which you'll see when you see the rates is really not very much at all. It's also consistent with the region's practice for their development charges, and it is supported by city staff and, as I say, the external development industry working group that we've been working with. The bottom line then is, having considered these ourselves and with the working group, the consensus was that the recommendation should be for maintaining a citywide development charge rate moving forward, and that's the recommendation you have from staff, and it's one that I support as well. So just moving then to the rates themselves, you'll see there's two columns of figures on the left here, and the figures on the right are the calculated rates that are set out in the background study. So it's $15,777 per unit for a new single or semi-detached unit at the upper end of the range, and then moving down to a lower charge for the smaller units. The smallest charge being for a one-bedroom apartment, which is about $5,600 a unit, and then for a lodging house at $4,400 a unit. And you can see the pie chart on the right shows you the services that are driving the charge. So about a third of the charge is for costs to expand parks and major indoor recreation facilities. And then about 40% of the charge would be related to the hard services, the engineered services of water, sewer, roads, stormwater, and associated engineering studies. And you can also see on the chart on the left how the calculated rates compare to the charges that are currently in force. So they are coming down ever so slightly, but not by much. And on the non-residential side, it's a similar story. A calculated rate of $72 a square meter, which is slightly lower than the current charge of $76.50 a square meter, and the vast majority of the charge related to the roads, water, sewer, and storm. You'll note that there is no charge for some of the soft services, particularly the library and the parks and recreation components. We consider the need for those services to be driven entirely by the residential sector. So there's only a residential charge for those services. So overall then, the calculated rates are very similar to what you currently have in place. They're slightly lower than the current rates. And the overall decline in the non-residential rate is slightly greater than what we see on the residential rate. So it's a 1% drop in the residential rate and a 6% drop in the non-residential rate. Part of this has to do with some shifts in the development forecast. Part of this also has to do with a reallocation of some of the costs between the residential and the non-residential sector. When you look at the way the charges have changed on a service-by-service basis, you'll see some more significant shifts. And so for some of the soft services like libraries, you'll see quite a substantial increase in the rate. So part of what's going on there is that the levels of service in the city have increased in recent years, and that increases the ability of the city to fund those services moving forward. And you'll see, particularly for the hard services, that some of the rates have come down quite substantially, particularly in the water and wastewater. And the reason for that is that the capital program for that service is smaller than it was a few years ago. A lot of the significant projects have either been completed or have been funded and no longer require DC funding. I think I'm going to hand it over to Michael here again. Okay.
Okay, so these draft rates that we've just shared with you, they've been reviewed with the city's industry working group. They're available to the public on the city's website as noted in the report. Discussions are ongoing with our internal working group, with our external industry working group on the capital program, the development forecast data, and also the policy and administrative updates that we're planning to do for the bylaw, and also how this impacts resultant rates. We provided some local comparator info to show the current Waterloo DCs as well as the calculated draft rates compared to our neighbors. On the residential side, you'll see that Waterloo is very, very comparable, if not the lowest outside of Kitchener's central rate, which is an area rated development charge for their infill area. One thing to note is that all municipalities around us, so Kitchener, Cambridge, and also the region of Waterloo have all updated their development charge bylaw in 2019. So these are all current rates, all fresh, all very updated from our neighbors. So we're getting a good comparison of like to like here. So on, as Stefan mentioned, our single and semis and our apartment rates, they're all very comparable to the previous bylaw. They're going down ever so slightly. And comparing it with our neighbors, we see that actually we're a little more comparable with our neighbors, compared to our neighbors. Now, this is just the lower tier DC is noted in the slide. The region and educational development charges are imposed on development as well, but they're imposed uniformly, so it doesn't really change the ups and downs of the graph. It's just the charge is higher. So, for example, the region's charge is somewhere around $20,000 for a single attached, but it's the same for every municipality, so I've omitted it in our comparison just to look at the influencing factors of the local comparison rate. The one thing to note is that for the four plus bedroom rate being the highest in Waterloo, we've always had a significant student population. So a couple of DC bylaws ago, we've kind of instituted a multiple rate for apartments, whereas the region and our neighboring municipalities all have one DC rate for apartments. We've chosen to go with a one bedroom apartment rate, a 2 to 3 bedroom rate, and then a 4 plus rate, just to provide a bit more granularity and fairness for our development community. With the one rate system, it's thought of that it's not a one size fits all. There's a lot of one bedroom apartments being built for specific demographics. There's also some larger units being built for other demographics. So having the different distinguished rate is what we've always done in the past to kind of acknowledge that for the development community. On the non-residential side, as Stefan mentioned, our non-res rate is going down slightly from our current rate. However, we're still a little bit higher versus our neighbors on the non-residential side. This has been a long-standing pattern comparison for several years. We've always been a bit higher than our neighbors, and one of the factors contributing to this is that we don't have a large non-residential forecast or industrial space expansion like our neighbors do. Our forecast is probably half the floor space that Kitchener's is for expansion, so we still require that infrastructure to be built. However, we have a smaller base to apply that cost to, so it results usually in a bit of a higher charge for the non-residential sector. In terms of policy updates and changes, we're not proposing any significant changes to the existing DC bylaw in terms of a policy point of view or exemptions or incentives. The goal is rather to just adjust some of the languages and definitions on the more administrative portions of the bylaw. Proposed changes are to align with the region's DC bylaw to make some of the calculations a bit easier for our development community. Are redefining some of the definitions so that it's a clear definition with the same bylaw, with both bylaws, so it's one definition for when they're preparing their forecasts. The redevelopment credits, we're proposing changing the timing to up to 5 years for residential and 10 years for non-res and mixed use. Currently, our bylaw has 6 years for all types. Refunds for development charges are increased from 1 year to 7 years from the issuance of a building permit if the permit is subsequently canceled by our chief building official. And the annual indexing rate is changed from January 1st annually to December 1st. So as per bylaw language, the development charges are indexed on an annual basis to account for inflation of the non-construction price index. So we've always been historically inflating this on January 1st each year, and we've moved this to December 1st to align with the region, but also all the area municipalities are now going to a December 1st date for uniformity. So rates are going up at the same time versus the region going up on one date and the city's going up on a different date, and also December 1st. So we're mitigating a bit of the rush at the end of the year when a lot of our building departments and our plans examiners are off on holidays for the holiday season. So hopefully that will help provide a bit of consistency and clarity for our development group when we're planning some of their budgets. And the last point on this in terms of for updates, this is more related to kind of some of the impact through Bill 108 that we're going to see in terms of secondary dwelling units and new construction. So currently our bylaw exempts secondary dwelling units for development charges if it's an existing household, but you're required to pay development charges on that secondary dwelling unit if it's a new construction build. So Bill 108 is going to be changing this, but we're proposing to update our language because it's going to be around the same time when the proclamation happens for Bill 108 is when this new bylaw is passed. So we're just kind of aligning it to what we anticipate will be happening through Bill 108, and that's that secondary units in new construction will also be exempt from development charges as well as existing buildings. Staff is recommending maintaining the following policy items surrounding exemptions. So we've always had a long-standing exemption for universities and colleges within the lands designated as academic in the official plan. So exceptions to this would be for development outside of the academic lands in the official plan, or if there's industrial or research uses on the lands where that's the main use, or if there's any commercial purposes on the lands. So things like apartment buildings or student buildings that are outside the official academic lands built by private developers are paying development charges. We're still planning to exempt temporary use structures and trailers and for construction trailers, things like that. Temporary buildings without foundations, we've always been exempting those. We're proposing to change the time frame to not exceeding 6 months though, to align with our the region's bylaw. Currently we have 12 months. So again, it's one of those things where it makes it a bit simpler to have the same language in both bylaws. And the date of August 1st, 2014 for industrial expansions, as it relates to the exemption of up to 50% of their gross floor area. So any expansion of an industrial building we have done before August 1st, 2014 is in essence forgotten. So anything after August 1st, 2014 will count towards that 50% expansion for having the DCs waived. Anything above 50%, they would pay DCs at the enforced non-res DC rate. So during our 2017 DC bylaw update a couple years ago, staff did review the viability of adding some additional discretionary exemptions to the bylaw for affordable housing and also to bolster non-residential development. There's a bit of language in the report surrounding some of the history and some of the reasonings why staff recommended not introducing any further exemptions at that time. They limit council's ability to review the projects on their merits and design on a case-by-case basis. Potential funding shortfalls can also occur if uptake is greater than anticipated, since the discretionary exemption needs to be funded from other city funding sources. And incentives for affordable housing and non-residential development are therefore best considered outside of a DC bylaw for those reasons. Things like a community improvement plan, we have several throughout the city, can be entertained in terms of having a DC grant. So the DCs always have to be paid, it's just how they get paid through a grant or whatnot is kind of what we were looking at a couple years ago. So for that reasoning, staff's not recommending including any further exemptions in this current bylaw outside of what we currently have. To sum things up, the update process is moving towards completion with proposed new rates to take effect on December 31st, 2019. All the information, as I noted, is on the city's webpage at waterloo.ca/development charges. We have our current DC bylaw information as well as the background study and the new updated information. Things will be added there as they're received. Staff recommend that council approve recommendation number 3 of this report to be used in finalizing the DC bylaw. And city staff and our consultants are also available to address any questions or concerns from council or the public in advance of the public meeting scheduled for November 18th. So we'll open it up to any questions for myself or our consultant or staff in general.
Thanks very much, Michael and Stefan, for the very detailed overview of a complex regulatory process that is also fundamental to our capital plan and program. I have one question off the top, and maybe I'll have more after I hear from my colleagues. But the first one is looking back at the differential rates by apartment by bedroom type. I know that a number of years ago we chose to move from per unit calculations to some granularity in the per bedroom piece to deal with some specific policy issues and planning issues that the city was having, and to try to link those planning objectives with the services requirements of some of those when we broke off the 4 and 5 bedroom unit stuff. And I know from listening to this council table and the previous council table that there's been an increased interest on the planning objective side around family size units being incorporated into apartment buildings. And one of the levers that the city has is how we categorize development charges and how many buckets we slice these things up to. So looking at the 1 bedroom per less and 2 to 3 bedroom charge, the 2 to 3 bedroom charge is almost twice the 1 bedroom or less charge. And I don't know whether or not that provides a disincentive on developers to provide more of those units, but I was curious about the feasibility in the timeline that we have now from considering collapsing those two categories into one, so it becomes 3 bedrooms or less, to reduce the disincentive for family units in developers' pro formas. So I was wondering if the feasibility of considering that in this cycle would look like, given our timelines.
Thanks, Chair Henry. I'll ask Stefan to help provide some input on that. They're developing all the model and all the calculations, so we got to be able to speak to the time frame and turning around the figures. We may be able to provide a couple ballparks. It's going to be a range within the current figures, but pass it off to Stefan to provide further info.
So, Mr. Chairman, it's not a problem at all to recalculate the rates. However, council wishes to proceed, it could be one single apartment rate. I would not advise collapsing the apartments with any of the other unit types, but within the apartment category, certainly proceeding with one apartment rate is fairly straightforward, or even merging it into two categories. So it could be the one to two bedrooms and then 3+ as well. That's a relatively straightforward exercise to do in a relatively short space of time.
Yeah, and I know we've got a public meeting on this file scheduled in November, so at the appropriate time, I'll look for some help with some wording to provide direction so that these options are before us and we can hear if there's any overt concerns that comes through the public meeting process. I don't want to circumvent information people already have, and there'd be an opportunity for them to engage with us in November on that if there was concerns. So with that, I'll look to other questions from Council. Mayor Jaworski.
Thank you, through the chair, to Michael or the team there. You mentioned secondary suites, and it just got me thinking, so what might be the cost today, Michael, of a secondary suite? So existing home, you want to put in a secondary suite, you come in for to do building, and then you have to pay development charges. Do you have any idea what that might be? Is that easy to calculate, or is that a tough to calculate number? Is it $1,000 or is it $10,000?
Sorry, through Chair Henry, just to clarify, currently, if you have an existing home and you want to add a secondary dwelling unit, there's no development charge.
That's the one that's waived, okay. Yep. And then if you're in a new home development and it has a secondary suite in it, how is that impacted in the development charges?
Yeah, so you would in essence pay a development charge for the primary unit, and you would pay the same development charge on the secondary dwelling unit. It's almost like a semi. You'd be paying two fees. Or a duplex, depending how your structure of jointness is. So that was a lot of the concern in the past, is that was, okay, well, we'll just build a new house and then add a secondary unit a couple months after it's built, and then to avoid the DCs. So I think that's a lot of the reason why some of the, not the whole reason, but some of the Planning Act changes are because of that, but also for more, ability of different housing types and things like that.
So now just refresh my memory from your presentation there. How do we propose to rationalize that then? To make it payable on the retrofit?
No, what we're proposing is that, in essence, Bill 108 will be saying that development charges won't be charged on the secondary dwelling unit.
Great. Okay.
At all.
I just want to make sure I had sort of had the opposite understanding that we're going to charge it additionally on the retrofits. But no, it's just going to be, if anybody wants to have a secondary suite, not a problem.
Exactly. Yeah. There's some other wording in terms of different types of development. So whether it's a multiple, like a townhouse or an apartment unit, there's other additional dwelling units that could be added as well without development charges. But the main one that we talk about is usually home, adding a secondary dwelling unit in the basement or things like that. It'll be exempt for existing or new construction builds. So you can have plans that show a secondary dwelling unit and you don't pay DCs like you would on a semi.
Okay, perfect. No, I think that's sort of the interest of council here, to have more types of that. So I had the opposite understanding. So thank you for clarifying.
It's helpful, and all that would, of course, be subject to zoning compliance, which is relatively easy to do in Waterloo relative to some municipalities and how they implemented it. Councillor Bonagor?
Through you, Chair Henry, I just have a question about, I'm wondering if you could walk me through the process of putting parks and libraries entirely under residential. I'm the Ward 7 councillor, so I am in the uptown bubble. But when I see facilities, that they're often being used by workers on their lunch breaks, before work, after work. So I see that potentially the corporate development could potentially be paying into these systems because they are adding to their use. So I'm just curious how it came to be that they're entirely under residential.
Through Chair Henry to Councillor Bonagor, that's a great question. In the past, we've had various methodologies in terms of calculation of the rates. So our previous bylaw, we've actually allocated, our current bylaw that's enforced right now, we've actually allocated some of the charge to non-residential. The methodology we've taken under this current background study, we've acknowledged that it's all going to residential. So it's really just the methodology of how we're deciding to do the charge. And again, we're open to feedback in terms of how that's created. Perhaps Stefan can comment on how other municipalities do it and kind of their methodology.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chairman, to Councillor. It's certainly true that, particularly when we talk about libraries, in recent years, the scope of services has expanded to try and accommodate and provide services for employment activities. What we found is that most of the people who are doing their job at a library are, in fact, doing work at home. Their office is essentially their home. So it's an ancillary office for people who work out of home. And for development charge purposes, work at home is treated as a residential activity. So they will pay their development charge through the charge they pay for their home. And that's the main reason for thinking it in this way.
Well, before you run away, just to follow up on that, looking at things beyond libraries, if we're looking at the rec complex, for example, we've got hockey before work, we have people going for a swim during their lunch break, we have people doing different things after work as well. So that, again, that's why I'm just curious as to how we ended up, like, what's the advantage of having the designation entirely under residential?
Well, through you, Mr. Chairman, we try to get it right. So we're not trying to lever an advantage necessarily. I think on the recreation side, particularly when we look at parks, when we look at how parks are planned for, they are planned for in tandem with the development of residential communities. So the way we sort of secure parkland and plan for parkland is generally in the context of residential development. Whereas a lot of the planning for employment uses either would be in dedicated employment lands, which typically wouldn't have parks in them or near them. So I understand what you're saying, but I think the framework really more relates to how the land use planning is done for those particular services.
That helps, thank you. And I have one more question, more related to this new process. So this might be to Ms. Reynolds or someone, I'm not sure. So I'm just curious, I noticed in the background study, there's, when you're looking at how the costs break down, there's a line there for road widenings and turning lanes. But, you know, this is coming to us before we have the transportation master plan update, is coming to us before we're making budget decisions. So I'm just curious how this all fits together right now.
That might be Mr. Ormson with his former hat more than anything else.
Through you, Chair Henry, and Ms. Reynolds may wish to add to my response to Councillor Bonagor. It's an excellent question. Basically, the funding is set aside in the DC bylaw for those types of transportation items as provisional. And if the transportation studies indicate that they're not necessary, they simply won't be built.
Yeah, none of that circumvents the budget process for council actually deciding to do certain things. But did you have something to add to that, Ms. Reynolds? Or?
I think Mr. Ormson said it well. The rate will be established on the basis of this capital program, but certainly council will have choices if there's a change in needs and specifics with regard to the projects that end up being funded from development charges. So I hope that helps.
Thank you very much.
And I have Councillor Vassar.
Thank you. My question is, I'm also curious to hear from you because I've had, and definitely you can respond, Michael, but we've had a chance to talk too. Thank you both for the presentation. This is new to me, and so the 101 language was very helpful. My question is just around this external working group. Which is obviously important, but it's pretty heavy on the economic development, like WEDAC is on it, and so is the Chamber. And while I understand and appreciate why you would have economic development on an external working group like this, There's a lot of other groups who are impacted by intensification, and particularly the scale of intensification that's happening in this community at this time. So thinking in terms of like gentrification and building sustainably. So I'm just curious about what are the best processes for representing all more groups on an external working group of this kind? Who is missing from your perspective? Or if anyone has thoughts on council, I'd be curious to hear, because I don't, aside from sort of general things that seem to be not represented, I don't have a particular idea of which groups would fit best to comment on this, and how can we kind of relatively aggressively reach out to those people who might be affected by this either directly or kind of indirectly. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, through your chair, Henry, to Councillor Vasic. I can provide a bit of input in terms of the history of our DC industry working group and kind of what not necessarily what their mandate is. It's a very informal working group. There's no chair, there's no mandate. It's just a group assembled of usually members of bodies that already have a liaison committee with the city. So the Uptown Liaison Committee, the Home Builders Association has a committee, WEDAC has a committee, the Chamber is informally involved through our Economic Development Advisory Committee. So that's historically our working group is set up with members of those areas that generally have a technical or professional background in, say, engineering, land use planning, demographics, things like that. So they assist us with pulling together information that's contained in the background study as it relates to population forecasts, zoning, land use planning, forecasts for our capital program. If we need to have what size of pipe go into this greenfield area versus a water main here, they provide feedback on benefit to existing. So how much is related to growth versus how much is borne on the existing tax base. That's the extent of the discussions we have with our industry working group, and it's been that process for the last few bylaw updates. The group's very, very receptive and very important in the process, and they help a lot in bringing it to where we are today. So it really helps minimize a lot of changes after the study's published, because they're working with us and collaboratively to build the study together. So to your point about other engagement, I think there's probably two facets to the engagement process. There's the current industry working group that we do that's more technical and the levels that we're developing the nuts and bolts, and then that derives the development charge, which all developers and land use planners pay, which really impact the other groups I think that you were speaking to. So we have a developer that may be developing a subdivision and they're paying development charges on specific units. It's calculated through the DC background study process. That may impact a not-for-profit group such as Habitat for Humanity or a church or another nonprofit group or an affordable housing group that may deem the DCs a bit too expensive to be able to make their project sustainable. So I think there's input that we can have engagement from that sense, but it wouldn't necessarily change the rate. So we calculate the development charge based on the processes we've been talking about, and then it's up to council to approve what that rate gets imposed at in bylaw. So council may choose to impose a lower rate or choose to impose incentives or grants that we talked about. So all that's part of the engagement process, where if a group that's would need incentives or be represented to provide input based on affordability, that's not necessarily what goes into the working group's mandate of development charge background study, because it's more looking at project sheets and forecasts of population, things like that. So we can certainly entertain a different public engagement process where we reach out to these groups for feedback and engagement, not necessarily being on our city's more technical working group where we try to have it as a small group where it's very one-on-one directive contact. So that's kind of what we've been doing with this bylaw update and what we've done in the past. So we may want to look at more broader public engagement. We have the public meeting for November where anyone at large can talk to the bylaw, talk to the rates, talk to where they're at, how it impacts their group. And so that's kind of how we've been doing things up to now. But again, we're up to information from council or ideas of how we want to change that, who we might want to reach out to, for sure.
Does that respond to your question? Or we got more from Stefan? Okay.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, just perhaps to talk a little bit about what other municipalities do when it comes to this. I mean, generally we find that development charges as an issue has quite limited interest. It's quite, I mean, I live and breathe it, but I recognize that most people, eyes glaze over a lot of the time. So definitely the most interest we get when we do this kind of work is from those who are going to pay the charge. And the city, I believe, has historically and this time around done a very good job of making sure that those who are going to pay the charge understand the basis on which the charges are set. And that's one of the reasons for bringing them in a little bit earlier in the process so that they can vet the actual figures and assumptions that go into the rates that we present to you. But as Michael said, we reach a point in the process where these are the rates that are calculated. Council can, of course, impose whatever it wants as long as it doesn't exceed those rates. And discussions about who's going to pay, whether it's a one apartment charge or a 3 apartment charge, or whether it's a lower rate or a higher rate, that engages broader economic development issues and land use planning issues. And that's one of the reasons why we release the study 60 days in advance. We have a public process. Certainly another group, largely unheard of, is of course the taxpayer, because any change that's made to the rates, if it's a lower rate, will end up on the tax base. The costs still have to be paid for. If they're not paid for here, they're going to be paid for here. So I think that was one of the reasons for trying to align this study with your capital budget process. So the discussions about who was going to pay development charges was done at the same time as you considered, how much was the taxpayer going to fund of these capital works as well. They kind of work in tandem. So I still think there's opportunity to deal with the kinds of issues that you've raised. Certainly we will be discussing, I think, how the charge is structured. That will engage economic development issues. A lot of the policies that Michael's addressed here engage land use planning issues. And certainly when it comes to what's going to be the quantum of the charge and how much of that is going to be borne by the developer versus the taxpayer, that will certainly be engaged when you do your capital budget process, which I think is underway as well. So I think that the process is ongoing. Certainly developers have been involved to date, but there's very good reasons for doing that. And I think there'll be lots of opportunity for you to weigh on those kinds of things moving forward.
Okay, I'm glad. Thank you for that, both of you. Very helpful. The other thing I don't even know exactly what my question is here, but it's exactly what I've been thinking too, right? What's not borne by the developer is borne by the tax base. And we know that developers are financially fine. They say that they need particular things from cities in order to make their project a go, which is fine. We're doing intensification, that's good. Growth is good. Better than sprawl. But at the same time, there does seem to be something unfair here, where those who benefit most from the rates being low have the greatest say in, of course, in addition to formulas that you use to create or propose the DC rates, right? But they have the greatest say in what the rates are, or feedback into it, right? Or ability to even ask questions the most. And so I guess I'm just wondering is how do you even make that more equitable, knowing that who comes out of this with the most benefit also has the most say. And I think the process is really good, and I think you're doing as much as you can, and it will go into public engagement. But it's something I'm concerned about, I guess. And at the same time think so how do we know that this concern that I have, I don't know if other people have it. And then how do we then, what's sort of the limit of what we can make a DC charge, right? Knowing that it's sort of anyways. So I guess my question is, how do we make it more fair from an earlier process? Not that you have to respond now, but we can think about this. And And how can we kind of max out those DCs, knowing that those who are paying the DCs probably can afford it a little bit better than maybe just a general lower to middle class person who's going to bear the brunt of what doesn't have to be paid for by the developer. Thanks for indulging.
I can respond, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of comments, first of all. These are the maximum charges you can impose under the legislation. So just to be clear that what you see before you is what we consider to be the maximum charges. And the second thing is, just in terms of developer input and having their say, the reason why we go to that group is because often they have the expertise about the cost of infrastructure and the forecast of development. We have to identify where development's going to occur, what the development prospects are, and these are people who do that for a living. So we part of the reason why we do it is not because they have a special interest that we want to placate. It's because they have certain expertise about some of the assumptions we have to make. And that's the reason for getting them involved in the technical side of things. But from now going forward, now that this background study is out, I would agree with you. I think that there is a broad interest in the charge, in the policies in the bylaw, in the structure of the charge, and all of the things that council needs to consider. And I do not consider the development industry to have any particular interest over and above all of the other interested parties that you're interested in. Thank you.
Okay, further questions at this point? Seeing none, I will look for a mover of the motion with some additional direction that we'll have to work out on stuff. I was trying to write stuff down, but I got bogged down in figuring that out. Because I think it's generally that staff be directed to bring forward an apartment rate structure that includes 3 bedrooms and less than 4 and 5 bedrooms in time for the public meeting, and then we'll take it from there. I think that's probably right. Correct? We got that? All right. Moved by Councillor Bonagor, seconded by Councillor Mayer. Mayor Jaworski. Any conversation about the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor? That's all of us. That's carried. And thank you, council and staff and consultant, for indulging my poke at the structure. It's been percolating in the back of my head, and I'd have side conversations, but obviously never conversations front-wise enough that it bubbled up before today. Next up, we have the Waterloo Memorial Recreation Complex expansion, release of funds, including a lot of development charges. And we have a presentation from Kevin Van Hoedegem. Kevin, go ahead when you're ready.
Good afternoon, and thanks everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to be here to speak with you today. I think this is a very exciting day for all of us who've been involved with this project for several years now, going back to 2016 and even earlier. So excited to be here today, and really the purpose is to seek council's approval to release the remaining funding left in the project to allow this to proceed to construction next year. And then we thought while we were here, we'd also have an opportunity to give you a background on what we've been up to the last year or so, as well as invite Park and Architects, Mario here, to speak with you and kind of share some of his vision and really the team's vision for this project. So in terms of the recommendations, with approval of the report, we're really seeking council's approval to release the remaining funding of $24.54 million as identified in the approved 2019 capital budget. So that's in addition to the money that's already been formally released. We're also seeking council's approval for the public art contribution in the amount of $242,538, and that be directed to the WMRC expansion public art. And then the last one's really a housekeeping item. If you recall, I was here in April of this year seeking council's approval for a number of retrofit items to the existing facility. This was one of them that was approved. It's essentially re-roofing the existing barrel roof of the facility. This is just to move that funding of $1 million over into the project. So what have we been up to? Well, since August of last year, we've been engaged with Parkin, working through schematic design to today where we're at with construction-ready documents. And as I've mentioned, we've along the way picked up a fairly significant retrofit component to the existing facility. So this is really not new work in a sense. It's really work that would have unfolded over the last or the next 4 years through the capital projects and the needs for this facility that's 25 years old. What we're trying to do here is really to bring all of that work under the umbrella of the expansion project for cost savings reasons, as well as just to limit the impact on the operations and to the public as well. So really this is truly going to be quite a big project and really transform the facility, I think, in terms of how it delivers community and recreation programs. So it's quite exciting. Now, Mario will dive into this in more detail, but just to orient everybody again around some of the major components here. So when we talk about new construction, we're really talking about the new community pavilion on the west side of the facility. This will be the new home of the older adult program, as well as just general community use as well. That has the bridge back to the existing WMRC. And as well, we have the civic front on the opposite side of the building, which is really the gymnasium. In terms of the renovations, you'll see in a moment the significant aquatic change room work that will be happening. We also have a space planning element in the existing building. This new fitness core that will be created up in the current banquet hall in the mezzanine level. Re-envisioning how food services will work, as well as looking at the main lobby, refreshing it a little bit, and looking at the customer service area as well. Retrofit, re-roofing, some mechanical and electrical upgrades, security upgrades, as well as the pool floor needs some attention. And then you'll see there's quite a long list here of things on the site, which you'll see in a moment, but parking, drive aisles, site services, landscaping, a new patio, pedestrian access, vehicle lay-bys, site signage, lighting, a whole host of things that I think will really enhance the function of this site, which is a really important one for us in the Uptown core. So just at a high level, really the guiding principles that have been with us for a while now. Energy and greenhouse gas reduction has been a big theme. Inclusive design and accessibility is one that I'm proud to say has been quite a big focus of the group throughout. Multi-generational design, obviously with bringing the older adult programming here and just the general recreation activities that take place, that's been a big theme. And then another one is really this idea of changing the current facility from a big event space to more of a community center feel. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, I think it's important just to take a look at where we started and where we are today. When this project was budgeted and when the feasibility study was done in 2017, the target at that time was basically to design and certify to LEED Silver. As we know that I've spoken about in previous meetings, LEED Silver in a lot of ways is very much building code now. The industry's sort of caught up to this milestone that was, in our case, set back in 2018 as our standard. So I think it was with that in mind that Council in 2018 adopted the new green building policy. Among a lot of things it did, one of them was set this target of 25% energy and greenhouse gas reduction, basically better than code, let's say by 25% in those areas. So at that time, we had already sort of embarked quite a ways into this project and budgets have been established, but we committed to looking for ways to sort of align with that target as best we could. One of the things we did coming out of that was to hire an independent energy modeling company. And this was a firm that specializes in doing detailed computer calculations of buildings to see how we are trending towards this 25% target that we adopted. And it was sort of, part of it was about keeping Mario and his team honest to make sure that we were continuing having this target in mind of how can we focus on energy and greenhouse gas reduction. So I'm sort of excited to be here today to say that exercise has been done and the results are extremely encouraging actually. So this graph here shows essentially the energy use per square meter of the facilities. So the energy modeling really focused on the civic front and the community pavilion, which are the sort of the new components that we're constructing. When you combine those elements together, you get the numbers on the far right hand of the figure there. So what this is showing is basically the reference building is essentially our same building, but had it just been built to building code in simple terms. So if that were the case, you would see that design would have an energy intensity of 312 equivalent kilowatt hours per square meter per year. That's then judged against the design that Mario and his team has come up with, which is the proposed design. And you can see that's the one that we're moving forward, which has an energy intensity of 176. So it's actually about a 44% decrease from basically building code. Similar numbers when you look at the greenhouse gas intensity. In this case, the combined effect is about a 46% decrease from building code. So again, coming back to our adopted target of 25%, I think it's quite a successful outcome and really moves the needle, I think, on what we're trying to do here with our facilities. Some other areas that we've addressed the green building policy that was implemented last year. This idea of solar readiness. So this is one where, for the community pavilion in the civic front, we basically designed the roof structures ahead of time to take the weight of future solar panels, as well as to put in some base infrastructure to allow more of a plug-and-play approach if and when we come and actually install the solar panels. In this case, one of the things we're actually looking to do as part of the next budget cycle is actually go ahead and implement the solar panels. So that's something we'll be talking about going forward, which would just further enhance the numbers that we've talked about already. The other thing we've done is electric vehicle charging readiness, much the same idea that we sort of put in the base infrastructure to allow more of a plug-and-play approach there as well. Climate resiliency planning, so we've looked at things like flood mitigation design approaches in terms of finished floor elevations, using block wall instead of drywall in the event that they get wet, things like that. Looking at durable, thermally efficient building envelopes, high efficient windows, M&E systems that are efficient, and also looking for incentives and grants where possible. So these are all things that we've sort of worked into the project in alignment with the new green building policy. Along the theme of inclusiveness and accessibility, a lot of, I think, really good work has been done here as well. And this has really evolved in thanks to Mario and his team over the last several months, really. But this is a facility, I think, that will be somewhat of a deviation from what we've done in the past here with some of our facilities, in the sense that when we look at the washrooms, we're really looking to do a lot of the inclusive washrooms. So these essentially are single occupant washrooms, much like you would find in your home. It's basically a single room. One person enters, has a toilet, a sink, that sort of an idea. And this is different than sort of a ganged washroom approach where you might have sort of a female block and a male block. This is really sort of a different approach altogether. The universal washrooms, there's a number of those that will be added. This is much like an inclusive washroom, except there are enhanced accessibility requirements to align with building codes. So these are things like barrier-free designs, adult change tables, things of that nature. I think a really wonderful development actually has been the inclusive aquatic change room. So in the past, this may have been referred to as a family change room, and we do in fact have one of those at the facility now. But what we're talking about here is basically approximately, let's say, tripling the size of that space. And it's one that the community really said that they use a lot and they love, and they would like to see it enhanced. So this, I think, is a really positive development for the project going forward. And then I thought I'd mention some other areas that I think are worth mentioning, because, again, Mario put a lot of effort into this. But other ways we've removed barriers, design with wider corridors. Movable furniture is an interesting one. Some of the feedback we got is people in wheelchairs sometimes feel excluded when they approach a sort of a cluster of seating that's bolted to the ground. They're sort of on the outside of the conversation, whereas when you design with movable furniture, it's easy to move that chair out of the way and allow them to enter the conversation in an inclusive way. So things like that have been done. Mobility scooter charging stations, safe pedestrian flow. Again, removal of doors is an interesting one. That, again, is a barrier for somebody. So if you can design without a door, that's the approach we've taken here. And also looking for persons with visual impairments, the importance of color and lighting contrast in design. Along the way, we've done quite a bit of consultation. So there's been a number of public open houses. And I think in some ways there's been some interesting technology that's been leveraged there by Parkin. I'm sure some of you have seen the 3D models they've printed. There's actually been headsets that the public have been able to put on with virtual reality, so they can actually walk through the facility in a virtual sense. It was really interesting to see the older adult population adopt that during the public open houses, and they were sort of the first ones to strap that on and walk through the building, which was really neat to see. And as recently as last week, we actually used that technology with the Grand River Accessible Advisory Committee, where some of their members actually put the virtual reality headsets on and were able to experience the building ahead of time. So that's proved to be quite a useful exercise. And I've listed some of the other groups that we've consulted with, and there's more in the report. And we'll sort of, I think that's one area there's definitely been a lot of attention paid to. Public transit and active transportation, I know, is a topic of much interest. From the very, very early stages, there was consultation done with Grand River Transit around their bus stop and related elements. So there is a bus stop on Herb Street, which falls within their mandated walking distance to the facility. So it's our understanding at this time they're not looking to bring a bus route down Father David Bauer. They have invested in some upgrades down some of the roadways that lead to the facility. And then we wanted to note that those with mobility issues, there are options such as the GRT Mobility Plus and the city's volunteer transportation service, both which provide door-to-door service, which we know is important for, especially for the older adult population that will be moving here. One thing you'll see when Mario gets into it is really the attention paid to enhancing pedestrian connections from all corners of the site. So where we can control things, we've really tried to pay attention to bringing people through the parking lot to the building in a safe fashion. We've had a parking study done as well as gone through the approval processes there, and there is sufficient parking for the anticipated demand, and there's additional parking on lots and the nearby on-street parking, as well as plans for future development if needed. And when it comes to bike parking, we're adding an additional 60 spots that will be phased in, and that's in addition to the 40 that currently exist. There's been a lot of work done on cost estimates along the way. So we've been working with a professional construction cost estimator throughout the process. So they've done basically 3 check-ins, Class C, B, and A estimate, which go from, say, plus or minus 20% variance down to where we are today, plus or minus 5% variance. So it's sort of the industry typical way of how you go through these processes to make sure you're value engineering along the way to make sure you're on budget. But ultimately, the true test is what the market bears, and that's what we'll know when we go to tender. We'll see what the ultimate tender price is. Just some high-level financial information. So based on that Class A estimate, the total project value is estimated to be $30.15 million, which is essentially in line with our budget. And just important to note on there that that's not the construction value necessarily, that's the total project value. So that's all the design fees, construction, soft costs, allowances, overhead, all that sort of stuff. So that's the total number. And to date, $5.6 million has already been released. So again, we're here today to ask council to release the remaining funding. We've been through the site plan approval process. We've also been successful in getting a GRCA permit due to the fact that the building lies within one of their special policy areas. So that's been a step that we've undertaken already, and we're in the process of applying for the building permit. We've also done a pre-qualification on the major trade contractors. So we've pre-qualified the general contractor as well as the mechanical and electrical contractors. So really the thought here is to sort of get a pool of qualified individuals to ultimately bid on the project so that when we go out there, we know with confidence that we have a good pool of contractors available. And then finally, the next steps and schedule. So really we're looking to break ground on the project in the beginning of next year. And you can see some of the key dates there that we've listed. The Civic Front, we're expecting occupancy of February 2021. The Community Pavilion, June of 2021, and total completion about a year later in the summer to fall of 2022. So we'll get into specifics of how things like the aquatic change rooms may be affected. We know there will be a temporary closure of the pool most likely to do some of this work, and those details will be coordinated with the successful contractors, and a communication plan will be put out for the public in advance of that. So at this point, I'd like to invite up Mario from Parkman Architects, who's been our lead architect with us now for a year and a half. And I know we've thrown a lot at him, especially over the course of the last few months, and he's done a great job responding. And I'm really quite happy with the work that Mario and his team has done. So I'll let Mario walk everybody through the final design.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mayor, Councillors, for the opportunity to walk you through some of the work that we've been working on since August of last year. This has really been a privilege to work on this project. I remember as an alumnus, as a student at the School of Architecture at University of Waterloo, walking through the site of the original building when it was constructed. So to be here and to be able to present to you the work that's been done is a great privilege. This has been a project of change. There is, even though there are four that we started off as 4 key components, as Kevin had pointed out, through looking at synergies in terms of like the work that we had been doing as part of the core components of the renovation and the expansion, there were a lot of opportunities for us to integrate some of the pieces that were considered beforehand, simply because we were as part of work that was being done in order to provide the expansion. So what I intend to do is go over the various different pieces. Hopefully the intent is to provide this in a linear fashion, to go over the site improvements and then talk about the various building components, the community pavilion, the fitness core, the civic front at the front, and then the aquatic change rooms, and then touch on some of the additional work that is being done as part of that synergy. So in the feasibility study, and one of the things that's quite apparent from the facility is it's really interwoven into a key component within the urban fabric. There are a number of different connections that have existed there over the last 25 years and are continuing to grow. So the ions stop a lot of the buildings that are in the Pi Institute, the Canadian Clay and Glass Museum. Those are all elements of what's becoming a very civic and very central piece of the community. And one of the challenges, or one of the opportunities, was integrating the various different components of the neighborhood through connections into the facility. And the pedestrian connection was one of the elements that stood out as being something that was very important to nurture and to continue to expand. So we looked at, and I'm quite happy with where it's going, where it's come rather, to expand on those pedestrian connections, to provide various different scales of lighting, to improve the security, the comfort, to integrate art as part of that, to make it more experiential, and to draw people within the facility and to make it easier and more accessible to come to the facility. And that includes things like pedestrian wayfinding. So as people enter the site, they have a better understanding of how the campus is laid out, because it really is becoming a campus, especially with the community pavilion being a part of effectively a separate building or a new building within the facility. And then increasing the bicycle storage allows for the various different modes of transportation to come in the various different scales. So, and not just increasing it, but also distributing on the site. And you'll see a little bit more of that as I talk about the vehicular component as well, since bicycles sort of trend on this hybrid mode. Accessibility, as Kevin had pointed out, was a key driver. So we worked very carefully with our civil consultants to manage grades, to balance things like the flood proofing, but at the same time in raising those grades, being very careful in order not to create obstacles such as ramps or excessive grades, in order to allow for easy mobility on the site. And for some of the longer distances, such as the walk from Father David Bauer Drive, we integrated rest areas and art along the way. So it allowed an opportunity for people who are using mobility devices and are having a little bit more difficulty perhaps in making longer walks, to encourage them to have those moments of rest and to be able to break down the walk into more manageable chunks. We worked very carefully in terms of how we laid out the accessibility parking, of course complying with the bylaws and the AODA, but also looking at strategizing where that parking was going to be located such that it was distributed on the site to allow for various different entries, all accessible entries, but allow the experience to be, again, not something that's segregated from the rest or confined to a specific area on the site, but allow people to park in various different areas in order that they can experience the facility the way that other people would. And of course, lighting and things like tactile wayfinding are elements that are also integrated in the landscape design, as are trees and attention to detail to create shade as well on the facility. So this is just a very quick overview. One of the elements that we looked very carefully was, you can see some of the rest areas there. So see pavements, areas where we have pavements and benches, in some of the treed area where there's existing woodlands. At the civic front, integrating the accessible parking into a secondary entrance, which we think will be which will be well used because of the shift in the parking dynamic that's from the existing condition that's there. And also integrating it so that there's the opportunity in the future, if there's EV parking or EV readiness, that extends into the accessibility stalls as well. And the other component that we looked at very carefully is this concept of how we can make the laybys and the drop-offs more maneuverable. We're making substantial modifications to the main entry drop-off so that it allows for vehicles to be able to maneuver substantially easier than it is right now, and also use modifications as an opportunity for us to create flush curbs and integrate things like bollards and the tactile strips in order to make the transition safer for the general public. So and those are the areas in yellow we've sort of touched on those elements. Bike storage is also, as I touched on, another another improvement that we're making to the site. We're increasing over double the number of bike storages that there are now, and we're combining between locks and covered spaces and locating them such that they're distributed again on the site, so that there's a correlation between where people bike and the kind of and the different spaces, since the facility is expanding and becoming quite dynamic in terms of all the different areas and programming opportunities that there are. So we'll go through each individual piece right now, so I can give you a much more granular view of the different elements. This is the community pavilion. The vision here, as Kevin had indicated, was multi-generational, inclusive, accessible. The way multi-generational is the way that we've interpreted it and the way that we've developed the design is making spaces flexible, creating the kind of spaces that are like a living room in a sense, in a lot of ways, where it encourages the different generations to come together, and it allows for some dynamics and flexibility in terms of how the space is used. So you're going to see that a lot in the interior spots, a lot of spaces where there's comfortable seating, there's opportunities for people to come together for a whole host of different loose, unprogrammed dynamic activities. And this is the kind of thing that allows for interaction between the various different generations within the facility itself. A lot of transparency, a lot of openness, so that people can see what's going on within the facility. Within the community pavilion itself, because of the clientele, the patrons that are using it, there's a focus in terms of designing that building specifically to deal with some of the unique challenges that come with older adults. Things like handrails to allow for easier maneuverability over long walks, spaces for mobility devices, softer materials to mitigate the potential for falls. Those are all elements that were considered in the design, and that we're proud to say that we've addressed with a fair degree of detail. High performance building is another pillar of the design, putting an emphasis on the energy efficiency, on the greenhouse gas reduction. The inclusion of the computer modeling, in addition to keeping us on our toes, also allowed us to make some very important decisions about where there was a cost benefit on using different technologies. For instance, we had looked at solar walls in the penthouse, and through the computer modeling, it was evident that the cost to integrate that wasn't getting the kind of benefits in terms of the greenhouse gas reduction as, say, improving the R value in the walls. So that was a very valuable process to guide the team in order to how to best appropriate the capital dollars to the building and which technologies to follow. So the other element here that really drove the design is this concept of gateway and integration with the Waterloo Memorial Rec Center. That the very iconic shape of the building has been adopted in the development of the community center, but done so in a way that it doesn't read in the same way. It reads more like a smaller scale residential style community center. The inclusion of stones and woods to soften, I think, the feel of the space. And then within the actual building itself, we've carried that in again, so using a lot of warmer tones and warmer materials, primarily wood and stone, in order to make it a soft, inviting space. So on the first floor, we have the administrative offices, reception area, and the lounge. And you can see we've worked to create views, connections to nature, to make the place, again, very inviting and warm. And then again, from the main lobby, reception has a very clear view of all of the different activities. You can see there's transparency to the different program rooms. The concept of the lounge being this central space where you have all of the activity rooms opening into it, allow for a lot of dynamic use of the facility to be able to open out, spill out, or to enclose the different rooms, allows the facility to be used in ways that the existing place that they come from, the ARC and the Wing 404, that don't have. So I think there are a lot of positive developments from the way that the building is laid out, and as part of what the design that we looked at was through the site plan was how it might expand. I think that the layout that we provided allows a lot of future proofing as well. So as this facility and as the community grows, the building lends itself well to a natural expansion to it. And then the rest of this is, in terms of the first floor, we have the meeting hall, which is open to a central kitchen. We've worked again with this concept of openness. So the kitchen opens out onto the meeting hall. It also opens out onto the lounge in order to create a very comfortable area where you can get like cookies, or you can just have coffee served. And then also to be able to change in order to serve some of the more the daily meal functions as well. The washrooms that are designed here, the approach, as Kevin alluded to, we looked at inclusivity. So we actually have, we've gotten rid of the urinal, and we've used the design that it makes it effectively a gender neutral ready facility. We recognize that from a demographic standpoint, there's going to be time before that gets fully adopted. So the way that the washrooms are designed are effectively done in a way that they can operate conventionally in the short term, and then as the population grows and acceptance becomes more ready, that they, without an infrastructural change, can simply become washrooms, gender neutral washrooms. So again, another view of the lobby space and the openness. We have a games room that opens out, lounge, and different program spaces. And then on the second floor, there's a bridge connection that links the existing facility. You can see that there's one of the lounges there, number 3, which is one of these loose spaces even on the second floor, where you have fitness room that opens out onto it. You have the community hall that opens out to it, but it can also be used as a general location for loose programming. So whether that's curling up with your e-device or with the TV, plugging in and doing something else, there's opportunities there for flexibility. And we have, again, so another view, a lot of transparency. And the fitness room on the second floor as well. We worked again to try and maximize the amount of connection to daylight and connect to some of the nice views and features that are created by the wooded area to integrate that into the design. Another key piece to this is the fitness core. So this is the view as it comes out. This is a transformation from the Hauser House. And because of a renovation, we looked at how we were going to deal with that same level of inclusivity. We are renovating the 2 existing washrooms that are there to make them change rooms. And then including a universal change room, which is number 3 there, as a separate piece. Again, limited, I think, it's limited because of the existing structure that's there and some of the space constraints that we had to deal with. But through consultation, I think that we've come up with a solution that provides the needs that were sought from GRAC and also from the community outreach. So this space has a new walking track to take some of the pressures on the existing running track that surrounds the rink off. And there are 2 fitness rooms, so one on each side. So you can see the view in the rendering, the view as you're coming off the bridge, and you get, again, we've taken some time to look at transparency in order to create space, these links, so that people can see what's going on. We've also looked at the integration of artwork within the fitness core in order to provide visual stimulation and to promote the natural features and some of the heritage, the community features through the works, through the curation of different artwork on the walls. And that's something that we have in our construction the infrastructure for, and we're going to continue to work with various agencies within the city to develop what it still looks like. So there's still ample opportunity to develop that piece as well. And again, the lounge area, so you'll see a lot of those loose lounge areas to allow for that unprogrammed use of the facility, and a view within the fitness area. So we're integrating as well AV technologies in there to bring new programming opportunities like some of the immersive activities through projections. So that's an exciting piece in terms of like the programming that's there that we're designing for. And again, you can see another lounge. We've really tried to maximize all of the different spaces and the nooks within the existing space in order to provide as much programming as we possibly can and as much space and lounging areas that we can. So the civic front, again, same elements, the same drivers, creating multi-generational design, inclusivity, accessible. We worked with the energy modeling in order to craft and develop the amount of glazing that we want that brings natural light into the gymnasium space, the activity court space, and balance that appropriately with the energy efficiency of the building, and you've seen the results earlier. Another key component is at the front here. There a lot of attention to developing a front that didn't detract or actually from the overall composition of the space. A colleague of mine, the director from Park and Architects, who is the project architect of the original building, spent a fair number of hours working with me in terms of developing a language that was complementary and didn't detract from the original design vision of the facility. And we were quite happy with the results that have come out from that. And we've taken that same language and wrapped it around. So you can see that it's blended in. It's not trying to be, it has its own level of individuality, but it integrates well with the existing facility. And you can see here we've also included areas where there are outdoor programming areas, such as the terrace that opens out onto the activity court, and the secondary entrance, which you can just see at the corner there, which allows for coatless, covered access to the main entrance, since the parking is that's been sort of reassigned, if you will. The way the parking patterns work is people will be drawn to use that entrance, and that's been a nice development over where we were at with the feasibility design. The floor plan of the civic front includes for the activity court, which is really the centerpiece of the civic front. We have a main concourse or main corridor that links that south entrance to the main lobby, and we've expanded and opened up a front lobby, which again includes loose furniture to allow for a very comfortable integration with the existing facility. So a quick view of the design and of the activity court itself. And then you can see again, there's a lot of glass, and that provides views from the public into the activity court, especially for watching younger children, for parents, but also to create a very dynamic, open, and exciting facility as well. These are the individual washrooms that Kevin had had made reference to. So we've included for our universal washroom, which includes a shower piece. So that's as an additional resource to the 2 change rooms that are provided for the activity court itself. There's a 3rd change room that allows for additional flexibility to the existing rink. And then in terms of how we've dealt with inclusivity, every washrooms individual, they're just simply washrooms. So it's a true leveling, if you will, of the washrooms and how categorization based on use. So I think the last piece here in terms of the major pieces is what's being done in the aquatics change room. There are other elements here. The list is very long. This has been a very challenging project because it's really kind of gone into almost every corner of the facility. So in addition to the change rooms, we have a new west vestibule that we're providing. There's various different lobby upgrades, barrel roof replacement. The concession stands in the rink, there are two that are seeing a substantial transformation in terms of the facilities that are there for food offerings. And there is mechanical and electrical systems and controls upgrades throughout, and some security upgrades as well. The aquatics change room will see quite a transformation. There's a bit of a shuffling going on in order to achieve that. So currently, the family change room has 4 change areas. We're expanding, we're creating a universal change room and expanding that to 12 change areas, plus a universal change room that includes all of the facilities to provide accessibility accommodation so that to the people who need it. So it includes things like an adult change table, but it also includes a ceiling lift in order to allow for easier transfer to the shower and to the toilet within the space. The design of the universal change room we've worked very carefully through consultation to provide passive security. So while the change cubicles themselves are fully walled from floor to ceiling, so you can't see within it, this falls in line with a lot of the newer trends with respect to these spaces to allow for passive security so you can see through the area. So some of the less than polite behavior that has been reported in these areas is mitigated by the fact that it's open and there's a lot more transparency within the space. And it's also visible, it's not just visible from the public corridor itself, but it's visible from the pool. So that level of passive security is there. The other element in the design is that from the main reception area, they have a clear view to the universal change room. So in the case that the alarm that's provided, the fall alarm that's provided, or the trouble alarm that's provided in that space goes off, staff within the reception area have a very clear view to getting to that space. So you can see in a little bit more detail how that's laid out. We have the showers, which again are open to the pool. These showers are not the same as they would be in the gendered, so it's expected that the design of that is for basically getting ready to go on the pool and then just quickly rinsing off after. The various different change areas you can see are spread out. We have different sizes to correspond to different uses. So we have smaller individual ones, larger family ones, and then the washroom itself. We worked carefully to design the new reception area to integrate accessibility components with that, in line with not just the Ontario Building Code, but exceeding the Ontario Building Code and going to the Canadian standards, so CAN CSA B651. And that includes areas like deeper reception areas for wheelchairs to pull up to, the heights. Some of the elements that are not fully described in the Ontario Building Code, but we've gone through and implemented those design standards. So I also have a bit of a walkthrough to help guide you through and give you a sense of the three-dimensionally how that might work. And for those of you who haven't had the benefit of the VR, this is sort of will give you almost the same sense. So, and it's about a minute long. So again, the site, you can see the existing, where we have the bridge, the views from Father David Bauer Drive, the sense of gateway. This is the front entry with the drop-off in front, a view of the lobby. We have some very nice double height space. It allows for a lot of light. The glazing that we're using has also got a wood baffle within it, so it helps dramatically reduce the amount of solar heat gain from that light. So we really get the best of both worlds. A lot of connection, a lot of open spaces so that you can see into that lobby area. and then transferring over to the civic front. So you can see the terrace there, the integration, how we've integrated that lobby area by expanding it into the very familiar entry into the existing facility. The new cafe area that we have that opens up onto the civic front, that provides food service at a very central location. That's a very positive development. Simple views into the activity court, and then the reception desk itself. And on the fitness court, this gives you a sense of the openness of it, the connection between the different areas. You can see again the loose, the soft seating, the lounge, views into the pool, views into the rink, which we also have blinds in order to control the views from that space. So, and it's looping here. So I think that's all I have. Hopefully that gives you a good sense in terms of what the building is going to look like, what the spaces are that are being offered. And I thank you all for your time.
Thank you very much, Mario, for the walkthrough and the very detailed overview, and Kevin and team on the staff side as well for all of the work to get us to today, knowing there's much more ahead that gets even finer into the detail and oversight. Looking to Council for questions. Councillor Bonagor, then I see Mayor Jaworski.
Through you, Chair Henry. First of all, can I just say thank you to everyone who's been working on this massive project. I'm very excited about where it's come to. This is a question probably largely for you, Mr. Seaver. So I'm really excited about the retrofit program and the energy savings that we're looking at with this building. But correct me if I'm wrong, the numbers that we saw, there was numbers for the pavilion and numbers for the civic front. Do we have numbers for like the finished entirety of like the whole building, or is that incorporated into what we saw?
Through you, Chair Henry, I can probably answer that one since I was involved in that maybe more fully than Sunda would have been. But so the energy modeling was just specific to the new components. There was not energy modeling done on any of the retrofit work in particular. It's sort of it's more of a technical challenge just from the blending of old and new systems together. So it's a little bit more challenging to get that granular with the energy modeling on the existing facility, and be quite a bit more expensive than the piece that we undertook. But certainly, anecdotally, we're expecting significant savings that could be monitored over time. So that's one thing that we do with the new green building policy, is sort of do a measurement and verification of energy bills after the work to see how we're trending relative to where we started. So that's something we are looking at doing.
Awesome, thank you. Did you want to?
Thank you. The modeling for the entire building is going to be our next phase. Is that the green building policy is the one that we are planning to do, which is going to elaborate on site-specific standards and site-specific improvements. And for that, we will be doing energy modeling for every building where we can make the biggest savings. So some of the buildings we will be spending more, and some of the one that we may not be able to. And by looking at it, there are WMRC, Rim Park, and some of the other facilities will become the top few candidates for us to sort of do this entire energy modeling.
I think that's a good wetting of the whistle for next month, when I think we see you back to talk more about that.
Yes. And this might be getting too granular for this stage, but when I was looking at the accessibility for the site and bringing pedestrians in, I'm just wondering if there are plans to make the trails and the pathways that come into the site, are there plans to make those raised so that the trails have priority? Or is this what you mean by like flush curbs? Or is there a potential to look at the raising of trails throughout so that essentially the trail and path crossings are the same height as the footpaths?
Through you, Chair Henry, and Mario, feel free to jump in if you want to expand on anything I say. But so we have looked at a number of different options. Certainly, like hatched line work and things like that is sort of one of the more cost friendly options to put in, but I know Mario and his team have also looked at sort of some raised pathways as well. And then I think a real enhancement is with the vehicle laybys. So right now, what we've done is we've actually incorporated a number of spots where, for example, like a mobility van can pull right up and kind of out of the path of travel, and then somebody can get out of that vehicle onto a sidewalk area as opposed to getting out in a drive aisle and have to navigate through. So we've looked at a number of things like that. There are some raised pedestrian areas that sort of enter the site, some kind of on the peripheral of the site. But if there's anything else, Mario, you want to add to that?
Yeah, so what we mean by the flush curb is simply that that it's not, typically a concrete curb would be 6 inches up, so this would be at level so that wheelchairs could transition over, or anybody with a mobility device. The challenge with some of the traffic calming measures, such as the raised walkways, is that when we have vehicles like the Mobility Plus come in, that's a bump that causes a bit of a discomfort, if you will, coming through. But the way that the site, we've taken a lot of effort to look at how the traffic movement, and I know we've worked with the site planning folks who have had us, challenged us and pushed us harder to get to work through the circulation. So we've looked at how we separate pedestrian walkway from vehicular walkway. Now, outside of that, right now there isn't any plans right now to develop any of the loose woodland trails. I think in the site plan, we actually, that is an area that's earmarked for potential expansion of parking or potential expansion of the community pavilion itself.
The reason I raise it is just given that with the discussions about transit, it seems to be that Erb is going to remain the key transit hub. And when you're coming from Erb down to that essentially rear of the site now, if you're a child or if you're someone who's elderly, you're very much entering right now an area that is for cars. And you know that the rec centre is your safe place, but you have to navigate from here to there to get there. So I very much appreciate that you're looking for ways to make that connection better. I think it's less about traffic flow and more about making sure people can get to the door and feel safe getting to the door. So I appreciate those efforts. And the final one is, and this may just be me misunderstanding the design showcase just then, but did you say that the accessible washroom, there would be windows where people could see into it, or am I misunderstanding?
I can assure you that there's not the case.
Just checking. Thank you.
No, the windows are into the common area, so the corridors, like where the lockers are effectively. So those are areas that you would expect people should be fully clothed or in their bathing suits. So, and it's just there again, for, especially in a universal washroom, to provide that passive security against any sort of bad behavior.
As the mother of 2 young children, I can tell you there will be naked children running around that space, so you might want to consider some kind of shading on the bottom half.
There are films to some artistic films that are there that will help mitigate some of that.
Excellent, thank you.
And from time to time, they may also be on the pool deck, depending on what they've decided to do. Mayor Jaworski.
Thank you, through the chair. My questions too are of a very minor nature. I think a lot of coach buses, as we know, unload on the west side. I'm assuming they're not going to hit the bridge that goes overhead, but I assume we'll look after that. But I really think, to Councillor Bonagor's point, I think we need to make sure that we're Grand River Transit ready. I think the big buses, the best we can hope for is they go on Father David Bauer Drive, and then we'd have to create a walkway in from that. But might be better off as if Grand River Transit, with their Bus Plus, the shorter, more shuttle type buses that could run around from Uptown, Father David Bauer Drive, Luther Village, the new development that's going on there around the universities, and maybe that we should make sure that just like we have Mobility Plus ready, that we're ready for whatever those smaller shuttle buses are. So if we could work with Grand River Transit, and then as regional councillor and the regional councillors of Waterloo, we could work, we want to intersect the future where we're going to have transit there when this place opens. That's, I think, all our goals here. So we just make sure that we're completely ready. Has that been thought through, Kevin?
Yeah, through you, Chair Henry. So, no, it's a great question, and I know it's one we've heard a lot from the community about over the last number of years. And it's a great suggestion, and I think it's one that we could work through as a corporate group, and we'll definitely take that back and look into it. I think what we've done is try to connect the site like as much as possible out, like you say, towards Father David Bauer. We're putting a new sidewalk in to get us out there. So, but I think the idea of sort of GRT ready is a smart approach and something we'll take back to the corporate level.
Good, thank you. And then we can work towards whether, how we bring it up through to the region, if not even tomorrow at regional council. So thank you for that. And then just small note again on the cafe. So the cafe would become the new cafe and the existing food services site would close. Is that the thinking behind here?
The existing food services would have the hot the gas-fired cooking equipment removed from it. That equipment or that role would then switch over to the arena, and the cafe that's provided in the civic front would provide more of a healthy options menu as well to cater to the people using that end of the facility. So
Mr. Scheer told me this poutine's very healthy for me.
I need the recipe.
I think that's with organic cheese curds, Councillor Henry.
Thank you, Chair Henry, through you. I have really comments more than questions. And first of all, thank you very much for taking the time to take us through all of the developments. A lot has happened since the last time we saw the proposal, so I know it's not been small hours of work that have gotten you this far, so that's terrific. One thing that struck me, and Councillor Bonagard touched on it a little bit, as I was listening to the pieces about the emissions and the changes that we're going to be making there, the green building policy is a really good example for us and maybe fit into what we're trying to look at is how are we actually responding to climate emergency? And we may have an example right away in something that we're doing here by setting a basic standard and asking that all of our buildings within the city are exceeding whatever the limits are. So I thought that was an interesting thing for us to continue working through. I also wanted to just give you some feedback from GRAC and also to say thank you for all the times you've come there. The group is really feeling like they are engaged and have enjoyed learning more about this project. So I know you'll have them continuing to be involved, Kevin. They really appreciate when you come. And my final comment is around the use of terminology, multi-generational versus intergenerational. And it probably is coming from my healthcare background. When we talk about multidisciplines, it's almost silos working together. But when we talk about interdisciplinary, it's bringing everyone together. So I just throw that out for some consideration. I'm really excited about this project, and I'm looking forward to its completion. So well done.
Thank you. And I have Councillor Vasic.
Thanks through you, Chair Henry. Yeah, really exciting. This is looking really great. I just bring a couple of questions from people who I've heard from in the community. And one is around the reception site. When I was at Wing 404 a few months ago, they were quite concerned about having the glass window or plexiglass window there. So I'm just curious how you landed on that in the design, and will that be part of the design moving forward, or is there an opportunity to take it down in our sort of quest for excellent customer service?
Through you, Chair Henry, it's a great question and one that's really evolved over the course of the project. So what we know about this site is there are security issues that staff do face. So we've been challenged with trying to find the balance between openness and a little bit more closed and secure environment, both within the community pavilion customer service as well as the rec center customer service. So we know with the older adult population, they prefer a much more open sort of environment. So with what Mario has proposed, if you recall, there's sort of a glazing element around the desk. When it functions as sort of in the daytime as the older adult component, that can actually be opened up. So patrons can communicate much in the same way that they do today. But then after hours, when the older adult program maybe isn't functioning and it's turned over to some other sort of community use, and maybe there's a single staff person back there, for example, it can be closed right up. And so there's a bit of flexibility built in there to meet different demands.
That's awesome. Great. And then the other piece, I was just curious when you were talking about you must have been talking about the universal washrooms, and you said that when there's more acceptance, they can be turned into the inclusive washroom. Did I get that right?
It's the washrooms in the community pavilion, which are right now designed as ganged washrooms, if you will. So, but each one has its own individual full height stall. And right now they can be designed and used, or they are designed, they can be used as gendered, so traditional male and female, but because they're only using the one type of water closet feature, just the toilet, later they can just be, that gender assignment can be lifted and they just become washroom spaces.
So I was just curious if during the consultation, if that was something you heard from multiple people, that they wanted to have gendered washrooms, and so you're kind of appealing to that as well as sort of this move forward towards universal washrooms. Like, I'm just curious about where the piece of acceptance comes in, or is there not acceptance right now?
Yeah, through you, Chair Henry. So I think the piece we're specifically talking about is the washrooms in the lower level of the community pavilion, which is really primarily geared around the older adult programming. So within that community of older adults, we did hear some concerns that they weren't quite ready to move to a non-gender based washroom. Mm-hmm. So I think what Mayo's designed is quite elegant in the sense that right now you can put whatever sign on there you want and it will function whatever way you want. So it's really a decision, I think, that can evolve over time without a significant reinvestment to rip out washroom fixtures and redo them. And it would just simply be a matter of, when the time comes, changing the signage. But in terms of the other areas that we looked at, those would be signed as sort of inclusive right from the get-go.
That's great, thank you. And then the only other thing I wanted to add, you probably know this more, Mayor, than I do, but something I've heard from a lot of people is that if Mobility Plus is being kind of considered as something that's going to help people get to this site, what I'm hearing is that Mobility Plus ends up really just being used for medical appointments because they're so inundated. So I don't think Mobility Plus, it doesn't sound like it would get there all that often, even because it's not to a medical appointment. So I'm just kind of wondering, is Mobility Plus even something to consider as something that's going to get people to and from?
Yeah, through you, Chair Henry, it is my understanding that they do use it, I think, currently at the Adult Rec Center. But it is something that probably may have a change in use with this new facility potentially. There may be more demand for it. I think that would be fair, but it is something I believe is currently used at the existing facility. Yeah.
And I imagine the Mayor's just commenting the region's throwing tons of money into Mobility Plus on an ongoing basis.
Well, on Mobility Plus, it is certainly a challenge. There is a greater need than what the system can currently afford, and some of the things have been done with the, as Uber came into the community, to put money towards a reserve that potentially could be used towards that. But yeah, there's certainly a great need in our community, and as you know, with demographics and ever increasing need. So yeah, it's certainly on the radar of the region.
Councillor Bodley.
Thank you, through you, Chair Henry. Just a couple of quick ones. In the civic front portion where the storage space is identified, is that still envisioned as a place for neighborhood associations to store materials, event materials, and things like that? Could you just speak to that a little bit?
Yes, thank you. The design of it is such that that there's access from the drop-off, so it can be used for the community storage. Yep.
Very good, thank you. I know that's something that many of the neighborhood associations that I've been to and talked with are looking forward to being able to utilize. So that's great, so that various neighbors are not housing tables and chairs in their garages and things like that. So I think that's going to be excellent. My next question is around looking at the site sort of more holistically and thinking about it as a parent, and theoretically, and I'm going to tie this into the little parking lot that's across the street of Father David Bauer Drive as well too, that may or may not be utilized in the future. But I can certainly envision a scenario in which I'm dropping off my older kid to play hockey and walking across the street, or to go swimming and walking across the street with a younger kid to go to the splash pad, or possibly wandering and going to Silver Lake and doing walking the trails there, etc., and entering Waterloo Park. And so I think what you've done from a pedestrian access point, and to Councillor Bonagor's point from the south end of the site, I think that's really important, but also from the north end of from the site off Father David Bauer Drive is very important. And I guess What I'm hoping there will be some consideration for is through transportation staff is at some point there potentially being pedestrian crossings with lights like we see at some of the LRT stops that we have today to allow people to be able to cross Father David Bauer Drive to go to the splash pad, to go to Waterloo Park, and sort of safely cross that area. And I wonder if any of that has been considered.
Through you, Chair Henry, yes, it was considered. I think the challenge we faced with this, it started to be a little bit beyond the scope of what our project team was involved with, but it is something that we've also noted I think would be of benefit, especially as the park, as you know, grows in capacity. So I would be happy to take that one back again at a corporate level and have those discussions.
Appreciate that. And again, obviously it doesn't sort of pertain to what we're talking about specifically today, but I think looking longer term and looking at the whole area, I think it would be a great improvement to help connect those three sort of areas of the Uptown.
Councillor Veith?
Through you, Chair Henry, just a quick comment. Thank you for all the work on this. It's very exciting. And people that I've talked to are really concerned about the parking, and I'm happy to see that and particularly the accessible parking, because there's only 2 or 4 or something right now, and so this is a great improvement, and so the concern that I've heard, so thank you.
Yes, that's every member of council except for me. I'm wondering if I could take you back to slide 21 of your presentation on pedestrian circulation, because there was just one thing I was looking for a clarification of. Wow, we got up to 56. Okay. I'm glad I wrote the number down. Yeah, so this is the one. To Councillor Bonagor's question, is he coming up, Avondale, it's fairly clear you're separated, you make one crossing, and then you can get through. But if I'm coming up from Roslyn, and I'm heading to the rec center, I see my, the rec center today, I see my path, but if I'm going to the new community pavilion, it's taking me to the right of it, then I go back to the left of it, and I'd bet 95% of people go straight and stay in the parking lot. So I'm just curious about pedestrian circulation up from Roslyn and whether that's something that's a concern or what the rationale is for the circulation that we see on the map.
To you, Chair Henry and Mario, if you have any comments, feel free to jump in. But it is something we've looked at also. I think the challenge that we find with this site is we are trying to balance the need for parking and trying to lose that for additional pedestrian walkways is a challenge. So I think what Mario's done here is provided an entry into the facility, and then you would sort of cross over. But as you know, there is an opportunity, I think, with pedestrians to sort of circuit that and actually cut right through the parking lot. So I don't know, Mario, if there's anything else you want to add.
Yeah, absolutely. We've taken that into some consideration. The reason why it's shown in red there is that is a landscaped, more comfortable, desirable approach. But if you look, I don't have the luxury of zooming in, but on either end of the parking islands that are there and going from that access point to the community pavilion, you'll see faintly on your screen some zebra stripe lines. So there are walkways on either end of those parking areas to allow people to find a more direct route that's not within parking lot area. So.
And that's what I thought those might be, but when I saw the red overlay, I thought, oh, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe those are, the big curb things at the end of parking aisles. So thanks for the clarification. So you can sort of walk there and be somewhat separated, and that looks kind of like what we see coming in from the Avondale Father David Bauer intersection today, right? And you've got sort of those zebra crossings. I've run a stroller over several times. So that's helpful. I appreciate that. And I know we'll only learn over time exactly how people use the site and decide what their best path is, no matter what we decide today or through site plan committee. So thanks for going into that detail. Lots of folks have issued congratulations and excitement. I will echo those again. And I will look for a mover of the motion we have before us. Councillor Bonagor is incredibly excited. And I'll go with the mayor, since this is a citywide facility, for a seconder. All those Mayor has a comment.
Well, it's our 30th wedding anniversary today, and Jan, if you're watching, you said, get me something unusual, so I seconded this motion of this $30 million site for our 30th anniversary. Okay.
And we got lots of detail in the presentation, about a minute for every million, so I think that was very useful. Okay, calling the vote. All in favor? And that's carried. Marital preservation is so many things. And finally, we have item H, City of Waterloo response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. We have a presentation from Pam Albrock. Pam, when you're ready.
Great. Good afternoon, Chair Henry and members of Council. I'm pleased to be here this afternoon to present this report on how the City of Waterloo can begin to take steps toward reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in this country, both by responding to the TRC's call to action, that is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, and of course by taking additional actions outside of this list of calls to action that work toward building respectful relationships. I do want to emphasize that the contents of this report really are based on my learnings, the learnings of staff across the corporation to date, and I certainly do want to acknowledge that I still have a lot to learn in this area. But I look forward to engaging with colleagues, with council as we further this learning. So by way of introduction then to the contents of the report, I think it's safe to say that the reason we're talking so much about reconciliation at this scale, at this particular point in time, is really due to the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. The work of the TRC has awakened in non-Indigenous Canadians to the difficult truths of our country's past with regard to the treatment of Indigenous peoples. The final report of the TRC, which was released in 2015, notes that residential schools were, and I quote, part of a coherent policy to eliminate Aboriginal people as distinct peoples and to assimilate them into the Canadian mainstream against their will. The result of this was cultural genocide, according to the TRC, and I think that's very difficult to argue with. Children were removed from their families and communities. They lost their language. They weren't permitted to participate in ceremonies. Many of them lost their culture and have had to work extremely hard to reconnect with elements of their culture. The individual impacts have been profound, and I'm sure you've heard of many of these. The TRC heard accounts of children growing up without experiencing care and nurturing from the adults around them. Children were exposed to malnutrition and disease, and they witnessed countless deaths of their peers. And many were physically and sexually abused. And of course, this abuse has had lasting impact on the lives of the survivors. The trauma that survivors carried and are carrying has also had intergenerational effects. One of these being the 60s Scoop, a set of child welfare policies that took a disproportionate number of Indigenous children away from their families and placed them with non-Indigenous families. Many of the children removed during the 60s Scoop were actually children of residential school survivors. And while residential schools did eventually close, I think it
It's quite clear to us now, or it's becoming more clear, that mainstream ideas haven't really changed that much. Racism continues to affect the way we view and respond to the needs of Indigenous communities, as we've seen in the hugely disproportionate numbers of Indigenous women and girls who are murdered and go missing in this country. Also, our complacency as Canadians with the lack of drinkable water on reserves, and the list goes on and on. I'm sure you're aware of many of these. But even in all of this, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that Indigenous people have been incredibly resilient. Over 6,000 people were strong enough to tell their stories to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Communities all across Canada hold powwows and other ceremonies that people kept alive in spite of the government's effort to ban them. And there's a resurgence in language learning. One example being right here in our own community, and that is the course in the Mohawk language that's offered at University of Waterloo. With all of this as the backdrop, it's really no wonder that the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people is so broken. And so non-Indigenous Canadians are being called upon to work toward reconciliation. The TRC summary report notes that reconciliation is about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in this country. The report goes on to say that we aren't there yet, but there is hope that we can achieve this. I do want to just pause here to make a note about terminology. We know that our language is often fluid. It changes over time. At the time of the writing of the report, of the TRC, the common term used to describe the first peoples of this country was Aboriginal. So you'll see that word pop up a number of times throughout my report, throughout my presentation. But in even the relatively short time since this report has come out, it's become far more commonplace and more accepted to use the term Indigenous. So just by way of explaining why both terms are used. A number of years ago, I was privileged to attend a talk by Senator Murray Sinclair, who served as the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And he made a comment that has really stuck with me. He said that the calls to action were created to arm the reasonable. He went on to explain that the calls to action answer the question that so many non-Indigenous Canadians have and are likely to have, and that is, what can we do? What can we do about all of this? These calls to action also give Indigenous people something by which to measure progress. And so, along with staff across the corporation, I've reviewed the calls to action to determine which ones speak to municipalities and the work that we do. And you'll see in Appendix A of the report that there are 11 calls to action identified, and the appendix further speaks to how we as an organization can respond to these specific calls to action. And in some cases, we've been able to identify ways in which we are already responding, which I think is great. I also do want to emphasize that these responses should be seen as a starting place. Our work on reconciliation will by no means be finished once we've made progress on these particular items. At this time, we've identified 5 areas of our work in which we can provide responses to the calls to action. And I'm just going to provide some highlights from the report. I won't go through all of the responses that we're proposing or that we are already doing. The first major area, I would say, is training and development. And in fact, there is a call that public servants at all levels of government should receive training and education on these issues. And as staff, we're currently researching options for formal in-class style training, and we're also seeking out opportunities for less formal training. So providing staff with reading lists, such as the one provided in Appendix C. Maybe letting folks know about community events where they can go and further their learning. There are also a number of calls to action that speak to the work we do related to data collection and records. We know that many residential school survivors lost their traditional names, and so one of the calls to action speaks to any supports that will help people reclaim those names. And so while the city itself doesn't oversee any name change processes directly, we do offer the service of commissioning documents that could be required as part of a name change process. In consultation with staff in those areas, we are proposing that fees for these commissioning services be waived when they're related to Indigenous persons who wish to change their names. And then further with regards to records related to residential schools, you'll see from the report that none are known to exist at the City of Waterloo, but certainly if any do come to light in future, we definitely work collaboratively with the appropriate bodies, including the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, to provide those records if needed. The calls to action that are related to museums and archives actually speak only to bodies at the national level, like the Canadian Museum Association, or CMA. Now, we as the city, though, and as an operator of a museum, we actually are a member of the CMA. And so should we be made aware of any recommendations that the CMA makes, staff would take the appropriate steps to review and consider any of those recommendations and see how they might apply here with our work. Again, with regards to arts and culture, these recommendations or calls to action are actually naming national bodies or the federal government, but we know that we do a great deal of work related to arts and culture, and we can respond in the spirit of these calls to action. And so I would point out that staff are already recognizing National Indigenous Peoples Day on June 21st in a number of ways. Orange Shirt Day, which commemorates the experience of residential school survivors, has also been observed here at the city on September 30th. The city also supports the powwow that's hosted by the Waterloo Indigenous Student Centre, or Satijirota, and it's held in Waterloo Park each September. In addition, staff in arts and culture will continue to take actions that include, but are not limited to, creating spaces and opportunities to highlight the work of Indigenous artists, and you'll see further things that staff in that area will continue to do. With regard to sports, staff will ensure that Indigenous inclusion is considered in the work that we do related to sport and inclusion, and there's more detail noted in your report. And finally, staff will explore ways of incorporating Indigenous inclusion into the work done related to economic development. So that may, again, be acting as a resource for any businesses who are looking for information. We can help to point them in the right direction. Or that may involve amplifying the work that some local businesses are already doing. It won't surprise you to hear that some of these actions will require funding, in particular training. That's definitely going to come at a cost. And I do want to note that staff have requested funding to implement Truth and Reconciliation as part of the upcoming budget process. So I now want to turn to the second part of the report, and that is the adoption of a territorial acknowledgement here at the City of Waterloo. We're dealing with it separately in the report and here today, as it's not actually part of any of the calls to action that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission put forward, but it really is becoming an important piece of the reconciliation journey in our community. I thought that the Laurier Students Public Interest Research Group, or LSPIRG for short, provided some helpful background here to help us in our understanding. And they note that a land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. And you can find the link to this resource in that list in Appendix C. Other reasons for offering a territorial acknowledgement include the fact that it makes Indigenous people visible, both as the original caretakers of this land and as people living here today. It also raises awareness that there were a particular series of events that led to European settlers occupying this land. And so, in response to requests from staff and members of council, we're proposing specific wording that can be used. And I'll just take a moment to read that now. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather today is the land traditionally used by the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. I also acknowledge the enduring presence and deep traditional knowledge and philosophies of the Indigenous people with whom we share this land today. As outlined in the report, this wording was adopted at the regional government level after consultation with the community as well as the legal team. So as a lower tier municipality, we do see some value in maintaining consistency in what we use across our geographical region. And adopting this wording also shows some respect for the time and effort that the community has already put into providing their input. As I noted with the responses to the calls to action, offering a territorial acknowledgement should be seen as a starting place in our reconciliation journey, not an end by any means. What I have learned so far from Indigenous peoples, whether that's in their writings, at speaking engagements, or in less formal conversations, it's really important to offer a territorial acknowledgement in a way that is mindful and authentic. And by that, I mean with an understanding of what the acknowledgement means to you, what it means more broadly in the context of our community. I've also learned that territorial acknowledgements should be offered alongside a commitment to further learning, conversation, and action. And we've just reviewed a list of actions that we as a corporation can take, which include a commitment to providing training. And so in addition to this list of actions we've looked at and the training that's been identified, we as staff will make available further resources related specifically to territorial acknowledgements. And of course, in the meantime, again, I refer you to Appendix C. There are a number of local resources that I think are valuable. And finally, we do expect to review this wording from time to time as we move through this process of ongoing learning and reconciliation. Thank you very much, and I invite any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Pam. I know on behalf of council, we appreciate the work that you help coordinate amongst many peoples inside and outside of the city to help us get to where we are today and where we need to get to tomorrow and in the days ahead. I wanted to move to the second part that you've got here, and you've talked about the community consultation that the region had done or engaged with on this. But I mean, I personally, I know, don't have any line of sight into what that looks like. So can you give us some insight into what that process looked like in terms of community engagement?
Yes, that's fair. Thank you for the question. Happy to provide a little more context than was provided in the report. So I think to start with, again, just pointing back to my comments about being part of the region and looking to them for some guidance, first of all. And in my conversations with staff there, I learned that when they at the region were starting this process, they began their process of consultation by connecting with staff members of the Waterloo Region Aboriginal Academic Advisory Committee, or RAC for short. This group provides advice to both the school boards in our region, so the public board and the Catholic board. It's led by the staff leads on for Indigenous issues at the boards. It consists of parents, students, members of the community, representatives of local Indigenous organizations, and like I said, their mandate is to provide overall advice to the boards on how to best support First Nations, Inuit, and Métis students within the boards. One of the things that they were tasked with was developing a territorial acknowledgement specifically for use in their schools. After extensive consultation with the community, this group prepared the wording that you've seen here today, and in conversation with staff from the region, there was a sense that a significant amount of consultation had already taken place, and we've heard from the community that the Indigenous community, the urban Indigenous community here is a small one. They are a significant one, but small, and they have limited resources, understandably. And we as municipal government staff, public servants, have been encouraged to share amongst ourselves any information and knowledge that we have gleaned from local residents as a way of helping them conserve their resources, I guess one might say. And so given the time and effort that had been put into the wording for the RAC and on behalf of the school boards, it seemed to make sense to adopt the wording. And that was done in consultation with members of RAC.
Thank you. I appreciate the additional detail. I think it's helpful given we're a community surrounded by and inclusive of a variety of communities, and there's a lot of work that has preceded us to get to where we are today. Okay, other questions for Pam as we go through, and then I'll look for mover. Councillor Veith.
Through you, Chair Henry, thank you for the report. You were talking about training for staff. Is that going to be in conjunction with, I'm assuming there'll be training in our neighboring communities or with the region? Is that working together on that?
Through you, Chair Henry. Yes, there are a number of us staff members from the local municipalities, the large cities and the region who do connect on these issues, and there has been some conversation about being able to offer training together. Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you.
I thought you were going to ask my question, which was training for council. Council would probably be interested in training too.
That's what I was thinking was coming next, but it was a good one. Yeah.
There's a large chorus of yes behind me. And yes, I would see no reason why that couldn't happen.
Yeah, and recognizing the limitations of council, similar perhaps to the IA P2 thing, where there might be some extensive and detailed pieces. Council may be able to have some things that fit within the auspices of council and council time that the clerk can accept, meet Municipal Act requirements. Good question. Any other questions for Pam? If not, I'll look to Councillor Vasic to move a motion.
Okay, so I'd like to move this excellent report. I'm very excited about the actions, and your presentation was so excellent and moving, really. So I would like to move this report, but propose a separate motion for recommendation 3, which would read, it would read this, but it would add that Council adopt Appendix B as the Corporation's current territorial acknowledgement and direct staff to undertake an ongoing review of this territorial acknowledgement in the context of its relevancy to the City of Waterloo, working alongside the diverse Indigenous peoples and nations who traditionally use this land. And so the process is, I can tell you why. And you all, why?
And I'll look for a seconder of that
Oh,
motion.
okay.
Councillor Bonagor, go ahead.
Now I'll tell you why. Okay. So there's a few things I think that while this is definitely everything that the city does is kind of a living thing, all the documents are living documents. I just want to explicitly state that in the recommendations. And so that's why the word current is there. And you said there's going to be a need for periodic review, and I don't disagree that there would be anyways, but I just like to see it there in writing. And so this is also not just coming from me. This is also the Heritage Committee has been doing lots of work on land acknowledgements and talking about truth and reconciliation in the context of the legislation that guides the work that that committee does through the Heritage Act, and there were some other ones, but I'm new to the committee, so I don't know all the legislation that guides them. And so they've also reached out to council and said that they'd like to have something a bit more detailed in the land acknowledgement. And so just two other pieces that are particularly relevant for me in this edition is thinking about how decolonization also means thinking about what it means to the context that we're in. So while the consultation was extensive and well done, it's not relevant necessarily entirely in the context of the city of Waterloo. It's relevant to the school boards, it's relevant a little bit to the region, although maybe peripherally there also, and it's not entirely relevant to the city of Waterloo. So I want to think about decolonization as what does the land acknowledgement mean, and what does truth and reconciliation mean in the context of Waterloo, and then whenever we're saying it at community events in the context of our own experiences. And then the other piece I think that came up from people on Heritage, but then also elsewhere, was this idea of consultation, but importantly, without burdening or overburdening people, and possibly even risking doing it in a tokenistic way. And so saying working alongside, I think honors this, and I'm not an expert either, but this spirit of the two-row wampum, right, where we're working alongside, and then when we need to, we can talk and we can work together. So that might involve consultation, but then it might also involve doing our own work and saying, settlers, this is your job to kind of figure this stuff out. And so I think working alongside kind of captures this idea of consultation, but also honors past agreements. And so I love that there's a territorial acknowledgement in there, and appreciate also that staff are asking for this, and so we need something, but I'm really excited to just kind of put it in here that it will be an ongoing process.
Thank you, Councillor Vasek. Any other comments from council? Councillor Veith?
Just, I need to understand the difference between what's up on the screen right now and what you just proposed, because I don't know, I kind of see it as, unless are we just tweaking a few this, or are we just talking about the same thing? No, just some clarification.
Sure, definitely. So I think what I'm saying is in the presentation, a lot of it is there, right? This like ongoing review of what we're going to do, but where it's not is in the document that's kind of like codified, right? Like it's just the recommendation is sort of the more official version of what we're wanting to do. So I want to capture that. So if someone were to look at this report and say, oh, this is the land acknowledgement we adopted, we're just going to use this forever, they could say, we don't need to invest any more money or resources into this because we have a land acknowledgement. But where I would say that this is more of a, and what this presentation is saying is that this is more it needs to be more of an ongoing process that involves some sort of appropriate consultation or working alongside. So for me, it's sort of it's a political statement to say we want the land acknowledgement to be more robust and more meaningful, and we recognize that in the motions that we're passing. And then no, I think that's what it is. It's to make a political statement, and it's to recognize that we want it to be even more meaningful and that it's an ongoing process.
Thank you, Chair Henry, through you again to Councillor Vasek. I agree with the sentiment, and I'm happy to see the land acknowledgement there. Where I'm stumbling a little bit, when I see or hear the words direct staff to do something, I'm thinking it's going to happen sooner than later. If we were supporting an ongoing review or we're expecting an ongoing review, as I listened to your response to Councillor Veith, that seemed to be more than at next month's council meeting or 2 council meetings down. Am I confused with that?
Yeah, like I'm not asking for a briefing note or anything. When I say undertake, it just means in an ongoing way. And so that this is work that we are always and constantly going to be doing. So when I say undertake, it also means we are undertaking this as a commitment to review how we are situated and how these land acknowledgements are situated in the context of ongoing learning about what it means to reconcile.
So, I mean, what I'm hearing is there's no expectation of the mover for a report to come back in January where something new will have been done. And I didn't put a year next to January, but the idea that there's something specific at a specific time. I'm wondering, Acting CAO Dykstra, is there speak to how the corporation sort of view the direction as worded to Councillor Henmer's point, and maybe Council can get a sense of whether that is or isn't the right direction it's trying to make.
To the chair and all of council, the motion presented by Councillor Vasek, we can work within that framework. We understand, and the clarity here around timing of that is acceptable to the team. So through our work, whether you get this team's updates on an annual basis related to the neighborhood strategy or another strategy, we'll come forward at an appropriate time to provide the updates. And based on the work that Pam's doing, where there's a need for an update to council, we'll see that. We don't want to overburden those that are involved with this conversation, but at the right point, based on the team's expertise, we will touch down with council. So that's the understanding we take from the motion, having had a preview of it.
And Pam?
Yes, thank you, Chair Henry, and thank you, Mark, for that clarification. I think I would add to that. I see it as reasonable also to provide whether it's an annual update on, like, looking at the calls to action and the responses specifically, providing an update, and that an update on what you're looking for, Councillor Vasek, would fit very well within that sort of a context.
I wouldn't want to burden anyone with the understanding that this includes the mandating of an annual update. I'd hope if council allocates resources to help deal with this through the budget process, that staff could come back at an appropriate time and tell us what an appropriate cycle would be. Councillor Veith?
So, Councillor Vasek, then you're okay with the wording of what's here, of the land acknowledgement that's in the package, Appendix B, for at this point in time?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, something okay. Like people want something, so I think we should have something for sure, definitely. Yeah.
Do we have the clarity we're looking for now? Okay, that's helpful. I wouldn't want to dive too deep into wordsmithing before everybody needs to go, I don't know, see their anniversary partner or try to get to a polling station. So have I had this? It's been moved and seconded. It's had conversation. Any further comment on this item before I call the vote? Seeing none, all those in favor? That's carried. Thank you very much. Consideration notice of motion given at a previous meeting. Have none. Notice of motion. I've heard of none. Communication and correspondence from either us or the region. We have none. Unfinished business. There is none. Is there any new business, council? Seeing no new business, are there any questions, council? Seeing no questions, is there a mover for adjournment? That would be Councillor Henmer and Councillor Veith. All those in favor? That's carried. And we're out. Happy voting.